which will focus on investing in America's economic and national security. I especially want to thank our great panel that's here with us today, and I'll be introducing them in a second. But first, I want to acknowledge that this is the first hearing in the brand new Budget Committee hearing room. And for those of you who were here before, it's quite a departure from the old days, but we are now high-tech and very modern. So we look forward to a productive Congress in our new hearing room. So our witnesses today, starting at my left, the right of the witness table, from their perspective, Sarah Abernathy, Deputy Executive Director of the Committee for Education Funding. I'm especially pleased to mention that Ms. Abernathy is a former Budget Committee staffer who is returning today to testify as an expert witness. Welcome back, Sarah. Stephen Koziak, Adjunct Senior Fellow for Defense Studies at the Center for New American Security and former Associate Director for Defense and International Affairs at OMB. Welcome, Mr. Koziak. And Dr. Umair Shah, Executive Director of the Harris County, Texas Public Health and immediate past President of the National Association of County and City Health Officials. Welcome to you. And finally, Mr. Gordon Gray, Director of Fiscal Policy at the American Action Forum. Welcome to all of you. And just so you'll know, the ranking member, Mr. Womack, is on his way from the prayer breakfast, and he is said to go ahead. We have Mr. Woodall here making sure that everything's on the up and up. I know he will. So I will now give my opening statement. Once again, welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the critical need to raise the budget caps for 2020 and 2021. Put simply, we face $126 billion in cuts to defense and non-defense discretionary spending next year. These budget caps were never supposed to take effect. They were deliberately set in 2011 at destructively low levels to force an agreement on a comprehensive deficit reduction plan. That effort failed, and we have dealt with this problem ever since. We reached bipartisan agreements to raise the caps in 2012, 2013, 2015, and again in 2018. If we do not act again, investments that are vital to our economic and national security will face devastating cuts. I reject the idea that we must pit defense and non-defense discretionary spending against each other, as proposed by the Trump administration in previous budgets. We all understand the importance of paying our troops, funding training and military operations, maintaining bases at home and overseas, and designing and building weapons systems. And we all appreciate the important role that a strong military plays in our security. But we cannot discount the important role non-defense discretionary also plays in building our economic and national security. As you can see on the screens today, we have listed just a sample of the government activities that fall into what we call non-defense discretionary spending. They range from homeland security, veterans health care, law enforcement, hazardous waste cleanup, and natural disaster preparedness. Then there are investments that provide economic security in the form of Pell Grants, Head Start, and even mortgage insurance. I could easily spend my entire opening statement just running through examples. These non-defense discretionary expenditures represent about half of all discretionary spending, and like defense spending, they are also at risk if we do not raise the caps. The president's unprecedented 5-week shutdown had one useful side effect. His shutdown reminded all of us that non-discretionary investments are security investments. During the shutdown, American families were worried about food safety, with the Food and Drug Administration's suspension of inspections. Travelers were delayed at airports and worried about aviation safety due to employee shortages at the TSA. And we were all concerned about the consequences of more than 5,000 FBI employees being furloughed and their investigative work being impeded. Beyond these examples, CBO reported that this shutdown resulted in a permanent loss of $3 billion from our economy. It left us less safe and less prosperous and hurt a lot of American families in the process. Next week, we face another deadline to keep the government open and funded through 2019. I hope the president has learned that no one wins when he shuts the government down, and that we can avoid this self-inflicted crisis, particularly when we already have another one on the books to resolve. As I said, spending cuts are currently scheduled to take effect next year if we don't act. Our witnesses are here today to talk about that. They are experts on education, public health, as well as defense and national security. And they will help walk us through the importance of these investments and the consequences if they are cut to the degree that will be required by the caps. I would also like to enter into the record a letter from ND sector of our economy, from healthcare to infrastructure, scientific research, and education, as well as for defense if we don't act. Without objection, so ordered. NDD United represents hundreds of national, state, and local organizations calling for a balanced approach to spending decisions. Before we get started, I want to raise two other major factors that will impact deliberations to raise the caps. Our veterans' health programs need an additional $10 billion or more per year starting next year because of the VA Mission Act. This new program is now an unfunded mandate because congressional Republicans were happy to make a promise to our veterans for expanded health care access, but neglected to write the check. Second, the constitutionally mandated census will be conducted in 2020, requiring up to $6 billion more in funding next year. Failure to adequately fund the census would lead to significant inaccuracies and misallocation of a broad range of federal spending. So we need to come up with funding for the VA Mission Act and the Census Act out of a pot of money that currently faces austerity level cuts. Clearly, we need to raise the caps for both defense and non-defense spending. We have done so in a bipartisan manner in the past, and we must do so again now. And with that, the ranking member has said to proceed. He will again be here shortly, and he will submit his opening statement for the record. So with no further ado, I will yield 5 minutes to Ms. Abernathy for her testimony.
Chairman Yarmouth, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting the Committee for Education Funding here to testify today about the importance of federal investments, including investments in education, to America's economic and national security, as well as the need to provide a substantial increase in the non-defense discretionary spending caps. It is a real honor to be here today. I have spent literally hundreds of hours in this room, some of which I actually recall fondly, over the course of 18 years when I had the privilege of working for the House Budget Committee under the leadership of 5 different chairmen and with several of the members who are on the committee today. But I have never sat on this side of the witness table before. I am speaking on behalf of the Committee for Education Funding, the nation's largest and oldest education coalition, which is a nonpartisan collaboration of institutions, associations, and others that advocate for greater investments in education. We represent the entire continuum from early childhood education to K-12 and higher ed, career and adult education, as well as out-of-school needs and enhancements like libraries, museums, and PTAs. In addition to representing its membership, the Committee for Education Funding is speaking on behalf of a majority of Americans who want to increase these important education. Increasing federal spending on public elementary and secondary education was a, quote, extremely important priority, and a Morning Consult and Political poll found that the area voters most wanted more government spending was education, a higher percentage than those who wanted to increase defense, homeland security, border security, or healthcare spending, for instance. Next slide, please. That's because education investments are among the best investments we can make for society. Participation in high-quality early childhood education impacts children's learning and has enormous long-term benefits, a return of more than $7 for every $1 invested through better outcomes in terms of increased health, reduced crime, and higher incomes. Money also matters in elementary and secondary education and in helping people continue education beyond high school. Those with more education earn dramatically more over their lifetime and have higher employment rates. Countries with higher educational achievement have greater economic growth. A better educated workforce leads to more research and innovation and national security in many ways, not the least of which is a military ready for today's challenges. Simply put, education pays. However, the United States currently devotes less than 2% of the federal budget to education. We think that low level of investment is a mistake. For instance, if Congress were to approach its pledge to provide up to 40% of the additional cost of educating students with disabilities, it would benefit all students by freeing up state and local special education funding to meet other education needs. Head Start currently serves fewer than 4 of every 10 eligible children. There are 2 children waiting to get into after-school programs for every 1 child enrolled, 3 in rural communities. And Pell Grants help more than 7 million low-income students obtain a college education, but the maximum grant today covers only 28% of the average cost of attending a 4-year public college, down from 88% when the program was begun in the 1970s. Next slide, please. While we know these education investments benefit society and our economy, in fact, since 2011, funding for education has actually declined by $7 billion in real inflation-adjusted terms. Congress won't be able to fill pressing education needs unless it raises the non-defense discretionary cap, which drops $55 billion or 9% for the coming year. But it's actually worse than that. As Chairman Yarmouth said, the effective cut is at least $65 billion or 11% because of the need to provide extra funding for the decennial census and the VA Choice program in 2020. An 11% cut would be devastating. That's the size of the education cut in the President's 2019 budget, which outright eliminated 32 education programs and cut funding for 25 others. Deep cuts like these fly in the face of the need to make investments that grow the economy, support our families and communities, and make the nation stronger. Today's successful students are tomorrow's research scientists who will discover cures to illnesses. Today's STEM students are vital to military readiness as they become tomorrow's weapons designers and programmers, keeping us safe from debilitating cybercrime. We urge Congress to make greater investments in education by first raising the fiscal year 2020 cap on non-defense discretionary funding substantially above the 2019 level, and then giving the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Appropriations Bill a much larger allocation which will allow for vital investments in education that will enhance America's economic and national security. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify about the need for greater education investments. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, and now recognize Mr. Koziak for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify this morning. I was asked to answer the question, how much of discretionary spending is allocated to national security programs? I'm going to suggest 2 answers to that, one based on a relatively narrow definition of what national security is and what kinds of programs contribute to it, and one based on a broader, although still constrained notion of what constitutes national security. In either case, though, the answer is a lot. Discretionary is primarily, or a majority of the funding in the discretionary budget is allocated to various national security programs. As a starting point, we need to recognize that as useful as the notion of defense versus non-defense is in terms of the Budget Enforcement Act or the Budget Control Act and enforcing the caps, it's not a very useful concept in terms of understanding how much of the discretionary budget goes to national security programs. We spend a lot of money on the defense portion, which funds the Department of Defense and other smaller defense agencies. Those agencies are provided a total of about $695 billion in 2018 and $716 billion in 2019, including both base and OCO spending. So that's a lot of money, and those are clearly very critical programs. But the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget, the NDD portion of the budget, also includes a lot of national security-related programs and funding. In 2018, even using a narrow definition of national security and what contributes to national security, I think a reasonable estimate of the amount of funding in the NDD budget that goes to national security programs is something like $217 billion, or about 37% of NDD funding. Some of you will remember the BCA initially back in 2012 didn't divide the discretionary pie into defense and non-defense, it divided it into security and non-security. The security category used at that time and embraced by both Democrats and Republicans when they passed the Budget Control Act included, in addition to defense, international affairs, the VA budget, and homeland security. In addition to these 3 programs, I include in my own definition, a narrow definition of national security programs, 3 other programs. The Justice Department, which is largely focused on funding law enforcement operations, including the FBI. The CDC, which is focused on a broad range of activities, but or through malicious actions of terrorists. And the food safety programs of the USDA and HHS, which protect against both accidental and potential terrorist-related contamination of the food supply. Deciding what programs to include in a broader definition of national security is more difficult and more subjective, but I think the list I'm going to share with you now is a reasonable starting point, at least. One would be the Department of Energy, which is focused largely on achieving energy independence for the U.S., which I think everyone would agree is a critical national security goal. NASA is the lead civilian agency on space activities, which I think has obvious both scientific and national security implications. National Institute of Health, critical obviously to individual health, but also for the health of the economy, as the NIH itself says in its mission statement. One of its goals is to enhance the nation's economic well-being. I also include in this list several agencies that are critical to supporting the development of both the physical and human capital of the United States. And I think anybody who has followed China's developments over the past couple of decades realizes the importance of those kinds of programs. And I include here the Department of Transportation and the Corps of Engineers, which are both obviously critical to the physical infrastructure of the U.S., and also the Department of Education, which plays the leading role in developing the human potential of the U.S., and which is obviously even probably more critical to economic growth over the long term. Altogether, adding this expanded set of agencies increases the total amount of NDD spending that's allocated to national security programs from about $217 billion to something like $392 billion, or the share of NDD going to national security programs increases from about 37% to 66%. So by this broader definition, almost 2/3 of NDD can be said to be allocated to national security-related programs. I'll wrap up with just a few concluding thoughts. Reasonable minds can differ over how much of NDD goes to national security, but whether it is 2 out of every $5 or 3 out of every $5, it's a lot of money. And to me, that reality makes clear the importance of reaching a new budget agreement that not only raises the caps on defense spending, but also on non-defense discretionary spending. Absent such an agreement, as has already been said here, the cap on NDD will fall by $55 billion, or about 11% in real terms. And in that kind of world, the only way to protect the national security programs within the NDD portion of the budget is to basically gut the other portions of the and I don't think either of those are either wise or realistic options, again emphasizing the need to reach a new budget agreement that lifts the caps on both defense and non-defense discretionary spending.
Thank you, Mr. Koziak. Now recognize Dr. Shaw for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack. It's wonderful to join you both and other members of the House Budget Committee. Thanks for inviting me to testify on this very important topic. I'm Dr. Umair Shah, the Executive Director of Harris County Public Health and the local health authority for Harris County, Texas, which is the 3rd largest county in the U.S. with 4 officials, which represents nearly 3,000 local health departments across the country. Today, I come bringing multiple perspectives on both health and health care. From a public health perspective, looking at systems from the standpoint of a physician, healthcare provider taking care of patients, and certainly also from the vantage point of families and patients. My father just passed away several weeks ago, due to chronic disease related issues and a traumatic fall. All these perspectives are so very important, and they all come together. In the interest of time, I won't be able to go into my full testimony, so my written testimony is here, but what I would like to touch on are 3 main points. 1, that public health truly matters, especially at the local level. Number 2, that further reductions in public health funding would worsen the health of Americans. Number 3, that investments in public health have a positive impact well beyond health. First and foremost, local public health is vital to the health of Americans and our communities. Public health often works behind the scenes as truly boots on the ground, performing disease surveillance, ensuring chronic disease and mental health efforts, advancing health equity, and these are just some of what local health departments do each and every day to keep our communities healthy, protected, and safe. We are truly the his offensive line. When we do our job, it is largely invisible. We have an invisibility crisis in public health, and as it impacts our ability to be appropriately resourced. To address this, I strongly believe the solution is centered in what I refer to as the 3 V's of public health, namely visibility, value, and validation. We must, first of all, raise the visibility of our work, and in doing so, bring the value proposition to the table. Once valued, we get validation, which goes through pro-health policies and/or investment in our work. This investment would enhance the public health workforce, modernization and use of technologies, and further the public health infrastructure. This value proposition also underscores the investment challenge that we have in our country right now, and this challenge certainly has consequences. This is particularly true for emergencies. I say this coming from a community impacted by a series of them over the last several years. with Hurricane Harvey being just the most recent. Let me correct that. Until we confirm 3 cases of measles on Monday of this week in our community, our work never ends. Number 2, reductions in public health funding would worsen the health of Americans. Evidence clearly shows that cuts to public health create a false economy. By saving pennies today, governments wind up spending more dollars tomorrow. Investments in local public health continually show positive returns on investment, yet today, rather than investing in public health, I can tell you we are doing absolutely the opposite. Fiscal cuts in public health are too costly and simply unsustainable. Across the board, cuts have unintended consequences that lead to worsened health outcomes and increased costs. This is especially true for the impact on our healthcare system in large and small jurisdictions alike and those most vulnerable. The result of these cuts would further the underinvestment in public health that we already see today. Decreased investment in public health leaves us more vulnerable, constantly scrambling to address the next crisis upon us, and forces us to rob Peter to pay Paul by taking from elsewhere. We must have adequate resources to do our job effectively. Number 3, investing in public health has a positive impact well beyond health. Health influences what happens in our sectors such as education, commerce, transportation, housing, and the environment, to name but a few of the connections. Optimizing health is the driver for true human potential, and in turn, it is key for our nation's overall collective potential. We need Congress to view public health as a key partner to build strong and resilient communities. I can confidently testify that public health funding must be given priority. Current funding is inadequate, and we are losing the battle. If nothing changes, we get more of the same: more disease, diminished quality of life, and lower life expectancy. This means more heart attacks, more strokes, more diabetes, more suicides, more drug overdoses, and the list goes on. This also means diminished resilience to disasters and emergencies. We are truly at a crossroads. It will be up to the wisdom and judgment of our elected leaders, all of you in Congress, to either act now and invest in public health or react later and overspend dearly to undo that which could have been prevented. According to the Trust for America's Health, the United States spends $3.5 trillion annually on health, but only 2.5% of that spending is directed to public health. We can and must do more, and we must do it together. On behalf of Harris County Public Health and the nearly 3,000 local health departments across the country, I appreciate again the opportunity to testify. Thank you for all you do in building safe, healthy, and protected communities where we live, learn, work, worship, and play across this great nation of ours. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
All right, last witness is Mr. Gray. You've got quite a tradition to follow. The 3 have been amazingly observant of the time limit, but you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, it is an honor to be before you today to discuss the need to fund the nation's economic and defense priorities. Like Ms. Abernathy, I also was a staffer to the Budget Committee, albeit on the Senate side. Please don't hold it against me. So it's a personal honor to be asked to appear you before today, and I thank you for that. I would commend this committee for holding this hearing now, anticipating the need to address responsibly the reset of the Budget Control Act discretionary spending limits for fiscal year 2020. In my testimony, I wish to make 3 basic observations. First, the Budget Control Act has been a valuable budget mechanism, making a meaningful down payment on deficit reduction while imposing a useful disciplining mechanism on discretionary spending decisions. Second, with that said, since the failure of the Supercommittee and the imposition of sequestration, Congress has essentially been playing catch-up in 2-year increments. Some of these efforts are more worthy of replication than others, in my judgment. Third, the congressional budget process is well suited to responsibly fund discretionary spending priorities in a divided Congress. I'll briefly discuss these in turn. In 2011, CBO estimated that the initial round of the Budget Control Act caps was estimated to reduce the deficit by about $750 billion to nearly $1 trillion over the budget window, depending on certain assumptions. That's real money, and given the nation's fiscal outlook, was a salutary policy accomplishment by the 112th Congress and the Obama administration. But between the 3 major elements of the federal budget, discretionary, mandatory, and tax, discretionary spending is the easy part. Congress, embodied by the Supercommittee, failed on the hard part, and the result was sequestration, a suboptimal policy regime that unduly focuses on discretionary spending, in my judgment. Realigning this policy necessarily means shifting a focus away from discretionary spending. I believe the first 2 bipartisan budget acts are good examples of that trade-off in practice. Eventually, Congress, be it this one or a future one, will need to embark on a significant fiscal consolidation. An ideal BBA 2020 would embrace that approach, fund our national priorities, and more than pay for it. A second-best option would at least pay for it in the spirit of the bipartisan budget acts of 2013 and 2015. And my final point is that the congressional budget process could facilitate this compromise if members choose to embrace it for that purpose. It would allow the chamber to express the will of its members while also facilitating potential compromise with the Senate. It has the added benefit of beginning now rather than in the waning days of the fiscal year. In short, the budget process is there for a reason and is well suited to the purpose before us today, but is only as useful as the members want it to be. Thank you again for the privilege of being before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
You did even better than anyone else. Congratulations. Thank you all for your testimony. And now the ranking member has arrived, and he certainly entitled to make his opening statement. I recognize him now.
I thank the gentleman from the great Commonwealth of Kentucky for giving me this opportunity. I apologize for being a bit tardy. We've been praying for our country this morning.
More than executive time.
And no executive time. Yeah, it was for noble purposes. But good morning, and thank you to everyone for being here as we discuss budgetary caps and our fiscal future. Today, we highlight the challenges related to discretionary caps and the competing spending priorities that will be impacted by them. Here's the reality. If money were not an object, we wouldn't have to worry about spending and funding all sorts of great programs. But federal spending is on an unsustainable path. This is exactly why we're here, to budget and set the priorities of our nation. The Budget Committee needs to do this with an understanding that it's tough work to discern between the things that we want and the things that we actually need. With regard to the specific topic of this hearing, I believe that discretionary caps imposed since 2011 have had value. They still have value today and should be extended and increased gradually, particularly to accommodate for spending on defense. Our founders made providing for the common defense a priority from the beginning. It's mandated in the Constitution. It's up to Congress to fulfill this duty. After years of harmful budget cuts that have previously impaired our defense, we finally returned to a point where our military leaders and troops have the resources needed and some certainty to do their duty. Stable funding allows our military members to plan and meet growing needs and threats. We can't build America's military by drastically cutting resources. We need consistent and stable funding as an investment in our continued security. This also means that we need to address the long-term fiscal health of our country as a national security issue, which brings us back to the main topic of this hearing. We're here to discuss discretionary caps, but this conversation, while important, is a waste of time without a plan to address the true drivers of out-of-control deficits and debt, and that's mandatory spending. So I've asked my friends, I asked them last week, and I will ask again, where's the plan? Again, mandatory spending is clearly driving up deficits and debt. Our nation's fiscal trajectory will remain unchanged if we don't address this fact. The pot of money we have to spend also gets smaller and smaller with ideas for Medicare for all, free college, and other initiatives touted by my Democrat colleagues. Rather than encouraging spending that will financially drive our country to the ground, I believe Congress needs to face mandatory spending head on. We cannot tax our way out of this problem, and to believe we can do so is being intellectually dishonest. Eventually, without reform, federal revenues will only be sufficient to cover mandatory programs and interest payments, and that's a scary scenario for everyone. We need to work together to confront this issue. In an ideal world, we would have a functioning budget process in Congress, and the Budget Committee would set the top-line spending levels for the appropriators to fill in the details. As we keep working toward the goal, I think it makes sense to both increase and extend the caps going forward while finding ways to address our out-of-control mandatory spending. I look forward to a productive conversation with today's witnesses. I thank the witnesses for being here, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member, and if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. We'll now begin our questioning, and I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Moulton of Massachusetts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to refer briefly to the comments made by the ranking member, a good friend and colleague of mine, who rightly brings up the challenges that we face as a country. And he said that we cannot tax our way out of this, but we certainly have tax cut our way into it. And the deficits that have been created by the Trump tax cuts are unprecedented in our nation's history. I also sit on the Armed Services Committee, so I have a perspective on our national defense from that committee seat as well. And when the Secretary of Defense and the chairman testified before the committee 2 years ago, I asked them whether investment in non-defense discretionary spending was important for our national security, and they both made it clear unequivocally that it is. Yesterday, General Hecker from the Air Force, testifying before the committee about the worldwide counter-terror fight, said, quote, "We have seen that the military solution isn't working." And what he meant by that is that critical to the fight against terror is that we have a political plan, that the State Department efforts on the ground are critical to the mission of our troops. This view has been echoed by General Petraeus, General Dunford, Secretary Gates, and many, many other defense professionals. The mission of our troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in other counter-terror fights around the world.
I think clearly, there's another quote is General Mattis, I think a year or so ago, said that if you don't fully fund the State Department's budget, you have to buy me more ammunition. So I think the military and former military clearly recognize the importance that international affairs spending plays in national security. Obviously, the State Department, USAID play critical roles in areas like Afghanistan, trying to build that economy, in other areas trying to build up and prevent failed states, in Syria, absolutely critical role in providing humanitarian assistance. And a large part of the State Department budget and international affairs budget, you have to remember, is not, it's sometimes referred to as soft power, but they're very hard-nosed analysts and decisions made as to where that funding goes. And a lot of it goes to protecting diplomatic personnel around the world and embassy security around the world. A lot of it goes to economic and security assistance to key allies like Israel, Jordan, Egypt. A lot of it goes to funding operations in areas of the world where we have UN peacekeeping to avoid having to have US forces go there. So it is, I think a lot of it is very critically linked and closely linked to national security.
In my experience as an infantry officer on the ground in Iraq, there were many times when I was asked to do jobs that I was unprepared for and untrained for because they were State Department jobs, but the State Department wasn't there. We also have a basic recruiting problem where 70% of the 17 to 24-year-olds can't meet the basic requirements for military service based on education or health standards. Ms. Abernathy, how does the U.S. compare with other developed countries in terms of investment devoted to education?
So we're right about the middle. It's hard to make an apples-to-apples comparison because the U.S. funds public education in a very different way than many other nations, in that most of the K-12 funding is at the state and local level, not the federal level. But when you look at something that OECD calls public education funding,
so we're basically in the middle. So if we
about
want to
the
be an
middle.
average country, we're doing just fine. We're
Right.
all set.
We're about in the middle in terms of investment. We're not about in the middle in terms of achievement, though.
Dr. Shaw, I just want to get back to your testimony on public health and want to make a few things clear. How will failing to raise the non-defense discretionary caps affect dealing with the following, the opioid crisis?
So I think it's really
I'm
important.
going to go through a lot, so try to be quick.
Okay, so really important to remember that we're already at a lower investment in public health. So when we start to decrease, we're further decreasing where
So it'll make the opioid crisis worse.
it potentially could. And that
What about
is-
chronic disease?
Chronic disease is the area that I am most concerned about, and I actually bring opioid crisis and chronic disease together in the form of mental health issues as well.
What about the health of kids in school?
Childhood development is absolutely critical to the success of our country, and further cuts would also diminish that development.
What about cancer research?
Cancer research depends on how we go about doing the cuts, because there's cancer research and there's also provision of cancer care. But in
What
terms
about the training of U.S. doctors at the VA? 70% of all U.S. doctors are trained at a VA facility.
So I'm proud to, this will be my 20th year of working in emergency department setting at the Michael E. DeBakey VA Medical Center in Houston, taking care of veterans, and I would say that the VA hospitals are fantastic at caring for and veterans, but also incredibly important for the education of our future healthcare workforce. And any critical cuts to those is a real serious deficit to healthcare education, and we have to make sure that we don't let that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. As we do normally, the ranking member and I are going to defer our questioning time till the end, so I now recognize Mr. Woodall from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman accurately noted Republicans' past improvements to healthcare opportunities for our veterans didn't fully fund those opportunities. I would point out we've got a bill coming to the floor today and tomorrow that passed by unanimous consent last year that both improved opportunities for our veterans and paid for those opportunities. And yet, when it came back in this Congress, having passed the committee unanimously last year and passed the floor unanimously last year, those pay-fors have mysteriously dropped out, and we're once again going to make promises to our veterans that we're not going out. You pointed accurately to a promise we've made for IDEA and absolutely never funded. The temptation education. It's to make new promises instead of going back and funding old promises. As you look at the federal role in education and the need to invest more, would you dedicate those additional dollars towards fulfilling past broken promises or to make yet a new round of promises?
I think there's plenty of need for education investments along the continuum.
Need, yes, but money, no. So if we have a limited amount of money, do you see new priorities that are more important than the old priorities we haven't funded, or should we aim for 100% of the past before we make a new round in the future?
I think it's always important to assess what the needs are. 15 years ago, we would not have thought about the need to have digital learning in schools. Mm-hmm. So if you had focused only on what was undone in the 1960s, you wouldn't be doing anything that you need to do now. So there has to be a mix of reassessing every year what the highest priorities are.
Of course there does. It would be my hope that we would either decide that we are going to fully fund the disability funding for our local schools, or to say, we're not going to pay that 40%. We said we were, but we're not. What we're really going to pay is closer to 10%, and then let's keep that promise instead. The history of broken promises, I think, undermines support across the board, because you can't count on what that new round is, which means to you, Mr. Gray, I appreciate what you had to say. Nobody wanted the caps that we have today. This is a function of failure. We created a joint select committee, said, look at it all over a decades-long horizon and agree on something that makes a difference, and they walked out 3 months later having agreed on, how much did they agree on changing?
I believe that was none.
Not one penny of change in either direction. So you still believe, looking at the Congress as it exists today, that we can come together in a way that keeps that bipartisan promise of 2011 to say we do want to invest more in these domestic priorities, but we also don't want to pass that bill on to our children and grandchildren. We care enough about it to pay for it today?
It would certainly be my hope that every Congress has that capacity.
That would be my hope as well. Listening to the opening statements today, I didn't get scratched by all the olive branches that were being extended left and right here. I wish folks could have seen these two gentlemen when they were working together on the Joint Select Committee on Process Reform, a bicameral, bipartisan committee. I wish folks could see us at our best. Because if we lock these two leaders in a room together, we wouldn't have these conversations any longer, because solutions would come out the door. Let me ask you, Doctor, I grew up in a lower middle class family. We went to the public health department for all of our vaccinations coming along, because that's where the value was. But as I sit here in 2019, most of the families in my district don't even know where the public health department is, because we have found new avenues for those services. It's my estimation that we could build support for funding public health if we had more individuals involved in accessing public health. What do you see on that continuum from your seat? Are we going to get more Americans involved in public health in a way that they see the value for their own family? Or is it becoming a service of last resort until, forbid the thought, a crisis hits?
So thank you for that question. I would say it's actually both, but I believe it really gets back to the comments that I made about the invisibility crisis in public health, is that we have this crisis where folks do not know in the communities oftentimes that public health is there, the value proposition that it brings, and the importance of the work, and the fact that it really does improve the health and well-being of communities. And so when folks are trying to then access to public health systems, if they're not even aware that it exists, there's a big challenge. And so we have to raise that visibility. That's the first step of the 3 V's that I mentioned in my testimony.
Well, I would love to partner with folks in getting us back to 2/3 of the budget going to investing in America, only 1/3 going to income support in America. But today that means raising public spending to about 35% of GDP, and that's not okay, but I hope we can get it done within the 22% of GDP that is available to us. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely right. No problem. I now recognize for 5 minutes, Mr. Higgins from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, investing in America's economic future and security are critically important, but it's also important that we recognize the size of the federal budget and its impact on the larger economy. The federal budget is $4.4 trillion. It's about 23% of the American economy. When there is uncertainty about things like shutdowns, when there is uncertainty about things like continuing resolutions, when Congress fails collectively to exercise its full constitutional authority to make an annual budget, that sends a negative message to the larger economy. There is uncertainty, there is instability. We have an obligation on behalf of the American people to use the federal budget in a way that benefits the people that provide funding to support that budget, and we don't do a very good job with it. The corporate tax cut last year, after 1 year, didn't produce the promised result. We were told through the magic of dynamic scoring that these tax cuts would pay for themselves. There's not a tax cut in human history that has ever paid for itself. The best case scenario is for every dollar that you give away in a tax cut, you can retrieve 30 cents. That puts you in a deficit situation. We were told by the White House Council of Economic Advisors that every American household would see between a $4,000 and $9,000 increase in annual income. That has not happened because it's never going to happen. So looking to use the federal budget more effectively to make investments that will produce the kinds of growth that is necessary to support a budget that provides very important services is critical. Infrastructure, for example, we have been woefully inadequate in addressing the nation's infrastructure needs. We have a tendency to view infrastructure in terms of the need, and the need is compelling with 56,000 structurally deficient bridges. But we also need to look at it economically and what it would do for this economy. For example, if we spent $1 trillion over 5 years, that would create 23 million private sector jobs. That's 4.6 million jobs every year for each year over 5 years. That's 383,000 jobs each month for the next 60 months. The direct spending itself would put $200 billion a year back into the economy. That's about 1% of growth attributed to infrastructure alone. But we know from infrastructure that it also has a multiplier effect. So for every dollar that you invest in infrastructure, you get about $1.80 to $2 in return. That's another $200 billion in multiplier effect. That's 2 percentage point increase on an annual basis. And about 2 decades ago, sustained. And it produced not budgetary deficits, but budgetary surpluses. So when we're talking about economic security, we have to talk about smart investments into the growth of the American economy. I'll just leave you with another piece on this. We spend a lot of money on basic research. Every technology in everybody's smartphone here has the internet. It has touchscreen technology. It has voice-activated personal assistant. It has global positioning satellite. Every one of those technologies, every single one of them came from government research, DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Products Agency. And 1 billion smartphones. Once they could be commercialized, all that technology, Steve Jobs took it and now makes 1 billion smartphones in China. All that government research, yes, it's improved our lives, but I think on behalf of the American people, we have to do a better job in getting a better return on the investment we make on their behalf. Any thoughts?
I agree. We think that investing in education has lots of returns for both the person who's being invested in, the kid in a school, the teacher who has a better pay, the person who can go to college, the person who gets adult education who didn't have it and wasn't able to read or do math skills. And these are all things that benefit the economy by having better educated workforce and more thoughtful adults who can do good things.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize Mr. Stewart from Utah for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and Chairman and Ranking Member, thanks for holding the hearing, and to the witnesses, I congratulate you. I think you've done a wonderful job. Yeah, and look, a couple comments, and then Congress view the world very differently. It's a little bit of Republicans are from Mars and Democrats are from Venus. We just have different perspectives on this. And some comments here are a good illustration of that. For example, it's an economic reality that you can cut taxes and increase revenue to the government. The 1980s is a great example of that. The Laffer curve is an economic principle that's beyond dispute. If you have a 100% tax rate and you'll have zero revenue to the government, and you can cut that tax rate and increase revenue to the government. So the question we have, and so I'd like to put some of that aside and focus, if we could, very quickly on some things, very broad principles that I think we can agree on. And I would ask the witnesses, if any of you disagree with this, unbridled debt, an uncontrollable debt would be an existential threat to this country. Can we agree on that? Okay.
Yes.
Anyone disagree? I'd allow you to disagree with that if you don't. Okay. The second one is that there are things that we may want, and this is true individually, and it's certainly true of the government. There are things that we may want to do, but we simply don't have the money. Can we agree on that? Then the challenge that we have, and that you all are trying to help us with, and that is we have this responsibility and this challenge of deciding what can we do? What can we afford to do? And what are our priorities? And we have also this idea that it's the government's money. It's not, it's the people's money. And we have this sacred obligation to ask the people to contribute to the functioning of their government and then to be responsible with that money that they give us. But it's not our money, it's the people's money. And I would like to focus on defense if I could. Some of you might see my military wings. These are my father's, actually. I come from a military family. I served for 14 years, and it's the thing that drives me here in Congress. And Mr. Kosiak, I might direct these to you, although Mr. Gray, you may have an opinion on this as well. But the challenge we've had is trying to balance these things. I think our debt is an enormous problem. On the other hand, I understand the fundamental responsibility of the federal government is to keep us safe. It is the one responsibility that the federal government is the only entity that can do that. And we try to balance those two things because just like others, there are some things in the military I'd love to do, I'd love to buy, I'd love to purchase, but we don't have the money and we have to decide what are the priorities. So Mr. Kosiak, talk to me about under current law and current constructs of the budget functions, should we increase our defense discretionary spending? Would you recommend that we do? And if so, by how much?
Well, I think clearly we have to, lift the caps for defense to at least not have the cuts that are currently going to happen under the Budget Control Act. I don't have a particular recommendation for how much we need, but clearly getting back up to those levels is important.
And I'll accept your answer that briefly if you could, because I agree with you on that. But if I'm going to allow your answer to make a proposition or I think it connects something, and that is we should base how much we spend on an idea of what the threat is. Is that a fair presumption as well? And what would be the basis for determining what the threat would you support the national defense strategy as kind of the framework for which we should make those decisions?
I think the national strategy is, largely reflects a bipartisan views about what is important for for American security.
Then I'll ask my last question briefly, and that's absent the budget cap deal, defense non-discretionary spending will automatically be cut by $71 billion relative to last year's enacted levels. And do you think Congress would you encourage us to try to ensure that that $71 billion reductions don't occur?
Well, I would say, again, as I said in my statement, I think we need to, there's security spending in both the defense side and the non-defense side, and we need to lift the caps on both those areas.
Okay, Mr. Gray, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, no, I think your point about the need to begin with defining what the mission of the national security apparatus should be, and the national security strategy and the national defense strategy should do that, and then we should resource that mission. That's how it should be. I don't think we should come up with a strategy and then later pay for some of it.
Yeah.
I think we should have a deliberate approach.
Well, and my time has expired. I wish I could say more, but in deference to the chairman, I will yield, and thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize Ms. DeLauro from Connecticut for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just maybe 3 quick points at the moment here. We need parity between the defense and non-defense discretionary spending. Secondly, if we do not raise the caps, the drastic and unrealistic cuts from the Budget Control Act will occur on annual appropriations. I sit here as a representative of the Appropriations Committee. Absent a deal to raise the caps, defense, yes, will be cut $71 billion. Non-defense will be cut by $55 billion. Now, Ms. Abernathy, in your testimony, I am the chair of the Labor, Education, and Human Services Subcommittee of Appropriations. And education, quite frankly, has been shortchanged over the past 8 years. You point out that from 2012 to 2018, funding for the Department of Education remained below the 2011 level. You also talk about the higher caps didn't result in substantial increases for the bill that I have responsibility for, that covers labor, health, human services, and education. Non-discretionary spending in terms of this subcommittee is one third of all of the non-defense spending. The largest non-defense appropriation covers programs and services that Americans need, including education. And the allocation has been seriously below what is in fact entitled to in this effort, thereby shortchanging the issues that you are talking about. I would make one more point, because I've made it over and over again. If we're going to do anything, we need to increase the allocation for labor, education, health, and human services. And to some of my colleagues who make this point, when you can talk about where our priorities are, and you can talk about a $1.9 trillion expenditure on a tax cut that isn't paid for. Let us get our priorities straight when it comes to making this nation strong with regard to education and health and, yes, national security. Ms. Abernathy, let me ask you this question. Can you give us some examples of the damage done by low education funding levels in recent years? Where should we focus on to reverse the trend? What kind of differences would it make to academic success?
Sure. So the Committee for Education Funding doesn't pick and choose among the many programs in the education world. We're fighting for a larger overall investment, but I can absolutely give you examples of where cuts have happened that have left students and education behind. The Career and Technical Education State Grant Program has lost 23% of its purchasing power since 2005. That's an area where there's generally fairly bipartisan support for career and technical education, but the support hasn't translated into increased funding to meet the need to keep to let students graduate from high school and enter community college wherever they want with training. The Federal Work-Study Program, which helps low-income students get part-time jobs while they're in college. In 2009, it supported 930,000 college students. Today, it helps only 630,000 students because the funding has been frozen since then. The main teacher and school leader training program has a long title, but it used to be funded at $2.9 billion in 2010, and now it's down to $2.1 billion. 35% of school districts use at least some of that funding to hire highly qualified teachers. 63% or 66% use that funding to train and provide specialized professional development for teachers. Without the money, that's classrooms without.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second because I want a quick question to Dr. Shah. So there are places where we can go if we increase the funding in these areas, which only, by the way, increases the national security of this country if we have an educated workforce. Dr. Shah, public health infrastructure. We deal with disaster relief in this country, and we say 7 to But I have suggested in the past that we have a public health emergency fund. We began to do that in the last appropriations bill with about 300, what was it, 300, it was $50 million, I'm sorry. But my suggestion is that we look to how we deal with public health emergencies through $5 billion in a public health emergency fund that can help us deal with whether it's an opioid crisis, Zika, Ebola, or anything else that comes up in the same way that we deal with fires and floods, et cetera, in this country. And that's not something we have today. My time is over, but your sense of that.
So I agree with, thank you for that. I agree with you. $50 million is a first step, it's initial. It's small, though, because really
budget dust.
$5 billion is really more in line with, Resolve is a group that brought together some experts. I happen to be called as well in that group, and they estimated that public health infrastructure is about $4.5 billion in the whole. And so really thinking about ways that we can actually get to that $5 billion mark, and then when you get that from capacity building as core, the biggest thing to remember is that capacity building is one of those core elements, and what happens is that if you have an emergency, if your capacity is higher, you don't have to stretch as much the next time you have an emergency, but if your capacity is lower, you have to really stretch, and then we do the whole reactive funding issue, which then becomes chasing our tails, and what we really need to be doing is proactive capacity building throughout.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Mr. Roy from Texas, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses. Dr. Shaw, thank you for coming from Texas. It's always great to see a Texan here, and sorry about your recent loss and what you've been going through. I have, unfortunately, had to step out for a minute to welcome a class of high school students from Alamo Heights, San Antonio, which I represent. So forgive me if I repeat anything that I may have missed, but I have not heard a great deal of conversation about the $22 trillion of debt that our nation faces. I have not heard a great deal of conversation about the upwards of 800 and something billion, 900 billion, almost $1 trillion of deficits that we anticipate this coming fiscal year. And so what I wanted to do is just take a second to make sure I understand the facts. As a new member of the committee, as a freshman member of the House, I wanted to just kind of walk through where we've gone under the cap process over the last 7 or 8 years and see if I understand things correctly. So I got a couple questions for Mr. Gray, if you would, and I'm going to kind of walk through some things just see if you would agree. If you go back to when the caps were implemented, in the first year in 2013, in fiscal 2013, if I understand it, we had a total BCA number at $1.043 trillion of discretionary spending for defense and non-defense discretionary. Does that sound right, Mr. Gray?
I believe so.
And then we had the sequester kick in, and then there's sort of a cliff, and it drops down in 2014 to a number of $967 billion. So we had a drop. 2015, $995 billion, and it sort of stair steps up. Now, I didn't know our brand new awesome hearing room has these fancy TVs, so maybe next time I'll bring a chart that we can put up on one of these screens. But what I'm walking through is this sort of, this line where we started with BCA, and then the sequester kicks in, and then it steps up, and it goes up through 2019, the year we're in. And of course, we're now looking ahead to 2020 and 2021. The reason I mentioned that, and we could go through each of the years and I could go through the numbers, I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page, is all of the previous BBA agreements, if I understand things correctly, in 2013 and then in 2015, we busted the caps for both discretionary defense and non-defense discretionary in the amounts of $45 billion, $19 billion, $50 billion, and then $30 billion. Serious numbers for any average American out there having to balance his or her budget at home. But now we jump ahead to 2018 because of the stated goal of the president and this body to make sure our men and women in uniform have the tools they need when we give them a mission abroad. We busted the caps in 2018, $143 billion. Is that right, Mr. Gray?
I believe so.
And in 2019, we busted the caps $153 billion. Does that sound right for the 2019 level, Mr. Gray?
I believe so.
And of those numbers, it's not quite dollar for dollar, but it was $80 billion of defense and $63 billion in 2018 of non-defense, $85 billion of defense and $68 billion of non-defense discretionary in 2018 and 19 respectively. Does that sound about right, Mr. Gray?
Yes, sir.
So my point of bringing that up is there used to be in Econ 101, right, this sort of notion of guns and butter, right? And having a choice between guns and butter. Now, I've firmly recognized the track that this country is on mandatory spending. We all do. It's unconscionable that we keep ignoring it and that we don't deal with it. But in the discretionary pot that we have, I think it is safe to say, and I just want, again, for all of us to understand and start with the same baseline, to use a loaded budgetary term, that when we're talking about the baseline and what we look forward to in 2020 and 2021, and we're talking about all of this non-defense discretionary spending that we need and that we're hearing, that we're saying that is allegedly needed, that at no point here is there a guns and butter question trade-off. At no point is there saying, hey, we need $80 billion of additional defense spending because we've got our men and women overseas in Syria and Afghanistan and abroad and doing all these things, and we need more training, and we need more planes, and we need more bullets. So gosh, we're gonna cut butter. Have we cut butter to pay for defense, Mr. Gray?
So I believe in the earlier part of that,
Right.
of that chart included, as in the overall legislation, offsets.
Well, but did we still have increases in overall non-defense discretionary? Yes. And then do we
Relative
continue?
to-
Relative, right. And so then in 2018 and 19, do we continue to have increases in non-defense discretionary in very large amounts of $60 billion and $68 billion in 18 and 19?
I believe that's correct.
I would just posit that for our conversations going forward, that trade-off of guns and butter is important, not just from a budgetary perspective, but also from a defense policy perspective as we look forward. And I look forward to having more questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Panetta from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Womack. Thank you to all the witnesses for your preparation and your time today. Fortunately for three of you, I'm just going to focus on Miss Abernathy, so you guys can take a break. Miss Abernathy, I want to just talk about something that's important to my district and actually eventually important to all congressional districts, and that's the census and the Census Bureau. I was wondering if you could just kind of give an overview. Obviously, you're familiar with the Census Bureau, correct?
It's not an education program, but
Exactly. If you could just kind of talk about the Census Bureau's current budget, if you have an idea on that, what constraints they're facing at this point beyond having to be furloughed in this last government shutdown.
so I don't know what their budget is, but I know what the increased need is for the 2020 decennial census. Every 10 years, Congress goes through the question about how to pay for this every 10-year huge burst in spending that is needed. I think it's something like $4 to $6 billion more needed for this coming year than it was this last year.
Why is that?
Because of the tremendously much more work that the census does for the, reaching every single household, and there's work that goes into preparation, and there's work into doing it, and there's work into analyzing it.
Are you familiar with how important it is to make sure they do their job correctly and ensure an accurate count, a complete count, I should say.
It makes a huge difference to tons of different federal programs, not the least of which are education programs, because
How?
lots and lots of the federal education funding is formula grant funding that goes out to states based on the numbers of, in some cases, low-income families. That's the same true for other programs as well that are beyond outside the education department.
And if there were significant cuts to the census, would that affect its integrity?
Absolutely.
How?
Well, if you know that the numbers are wrong, you're not providing, some places may be getting more funding than they would need based on their population, and some places would be getting dramatically less than they would need, and that would leave those folks in a bad situation.
Any populations come to mind that would be harmed by such cuts?
So this is definitely outside my area of expertise, but traditionally the areas where there has been large population growth, some of the areas with more immigrant families and more low-income, some of the urban areas as well.
And what would it mean for representatives in Congress if the integrity of the census was compromised based on budget cuts?
Well, Congress members represent people, their districts are decided based on the size of the population. You know, you'd want that to be accurate so that each state gets the right number of representatives in the House.
Great, thank you. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now recognize Mr. Muser of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much as well, Colonel Wormack. Thank you to today's witnesses for their testimony. I do want to start by stating I want to agree with an earlier comment made by my colleague, Mr. Stewart, stating in reference to our friends on the left that they feel the only way of increasing revenues is by increasing taxes. That's equivalent to stating that the only way a business increases revenues is by raising prices. Contrary, the best companies in the world increase their revenues by lowering prices and expanding their customer base, just as we should be doing is lower taxes, create a higher level of employment and economic productivity. We create more taxpayers as opposed to more taxes. Our revenues are projected, the United States federal government's revenues for next year are projected to grow in 2019 by 5.6%. That is a very healthy growth rate for revenues. Our problem is not in the revenues, our problem is in our spending, which exceeds that by quite a bit. Mr. Gray, as you likely know, between 2014 and 2018, discretionary spending by the federal government is spiked by 20%. Would it be fair to say and to assume that future increases in mandatory spending, including interest on our debt, of course, will threaten our ability to invest in important discretionary programs such as defense, research conducted by the National Institute of Health, education grants, disaster relief, homeland security, et cetera?
Yes.
Can you offer any recommendations as to the discretionary programs that you think Congress should analyze and determine if a funding reduction is appropriate?
So I believe that this committee, the Appropriations Committee, is well suited to provide oversight over individual programs. Though your earlier point about the budgetary pressures driven by the growth in mandatory and interest payments is a real one and will constrain choices, and so that oversight is all the more important.
Okay. So you're not prepared to offer any
On specific discretionary spending programs, I believe they should all be accountable to the Congress and to the taxpayer.
Okay, very good. I served as Revenue Secretary in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Then we we analyzed through the Department of Human Services, to assure that all people receiving government benefits were in fact eligible to receive those benefits. In the course of this review, we did save hundreds of millions of dollars on a near $600 million on a $25 billion or so budget. Do you think that a similar review of our federal government such expenditures would net a cost savings as well, and would it be worthwhile to conduct? And seeing our federal government is a lot more zeros than a state government, would it be in the tens of billions of dollars should we engage in such an effort?
I believe there are estimates of improper payments across federal programs that run into that order of magnitude. I don't know that it's necessarily practical to assume that we could sort of fix all of those and just capture those savings. However, it is clear that there's certainly areas to improve eligibility and scrutiny over the disposition of federal payments.
Okay, well, thank you. Is there anything else that you could add that might guide us this year from a discretionary spending standpoint?
Certainly. So I am broadly sympathetic and to the points raised by my colleagues that there are national priorities in the defense, in particular in my view, and in the non-defense discretionary area. In my ideal sort of budget, I've worked on this elsewhere, you can fund those priorities while, as I noted earlier, also taking on the important work of the fiscal consolidation that is eventually going to happen. It's really just about when we decide to do it. And so I think you can fund those priorities while also pursuing, I think, a fiscally responsible budget plan.
I agree, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize Mr. Horsford of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to address what is probably one of the most important issues, which is the overall budget blueprint for our nation and the topics that we're covering here today. I want to start by asking Mr. Koziak, you were the Associate OMB Director for 5.5 years. During the period when these mandatory caps were put in place because of Congress's failure to come up with a alternative deficit reduction plan, is that correct? And is that correct?
Yes.
And is it correct that these caps were never meant to go into effect? That the perspective was they were so austere, in fact, that they felt it was really impractical that these forced reductions would go into effect. Is that correct?
I think that was widely shared view both on the Republican and Democratic side.
So would you characterize this as a self-imposed action based on a previous Congress because of their failure? Process?
Well, I don't know whether I'd want to blame a previous Congress or not, but I do think it is a result of a failure to agree on a combination of potential slowing of growth in mandatory spending and increasing taxes. I mean, I think that was the assumption, was that something would come that would address those two parts of mandatory spending and taxes, and that failure put us in this situation.
And since then, not only have we not addressed the revenue equation based on the last action, in fact, now we have tax cuts that have exacerbated the problem further.
That's correct.
So I just want to be clear, since my colleagues on the other side repeatedly have this morning characterized this as somehow pitting defense and non-defense spending against one another. I want to make it absolutely clear, at least for myself, and I believe most of my colleagues on this side, that is not the case. In my district, I have several military bases, including Nellis Air Force Base and Creech Air Force Base, and I support military spending, particularly for the men and women who are in active duty, who are living on marginal wages, some of whom their families are having to rely on public assistance to get by and have to go to food banks in order to make ends meet. So I just don't want that characterization to go unanswered. I do want to, though, shift to the point of, if we're going to support defense spending, do we have an obligation to take care of those veterans and their families when they return? Do you on the panel believe that? According to the Veterans Office, the VA office, the last report in 2018, there are 45,000 vacancies in the VA healthcare system as of 2018. I have a VA hospital in my district. There are over 400 vacancies across multiple positions. Dr. Shaw, is it true that most doctors, healthcare professionals get their training in VA hospitals?
A vast majority do, yes.
About 70%. And so if we are failing to properly fund the VA, are we contributing to veterans and their family members being able to have the adequate support and services from the VA hospital that we allege to be offering?
Well, first and foremost, we do have an obligation to take care of our veterans, and it's an honor and privilege to have done so, and I continue to believe that educating our healthcare professionals in the incredible journey of what it's like to take care of veterans is absolutely critical. In addition to that, we also have to be thinking about the value proposition overall that we really need to move from is this healthcare delivery conundrum, where $3.5 trillion is spent every year on healthcare delivery, to really shifting upstream so that we can prevent people from getting sick and injured in the first place. And I think and I'm not just talking about the VA, I'm talking about in general, the shift from $3.5 trillion on healthcare delivery to public health prevention and upstream type of activities that really allow us to keep our communities, the people that live in those communities, healthy and safe and protected.
And so if the caps are not addressed, and these cuts to the VA are imposed, what does this mean for the profession and our ability to provide that care?
Well, anytime you have healthcare professionals who are not being educated in that full spectrum, not just VA, but in public health sector, in public hospital systems, and being able to really work with an incredibly diverse set of communities, understand what that really means, what it looks like, what it feels like to take care of people from different walks of life and different backgrounds. Whenever you jeopardize that, even potentially, you have a significant challenge in the future that you then have to somehow try to make up for that healthcare education that's been missing, that gap that's missing. So I would say that any potential challenge to that VA system that really allows for or really furthers this inequity where all of a sudden you cannot provide for healthcare education to future healthcare professionals, that's a problem, and that's something we cannot have, and we have to really be thinking about how to address that appropriately up front and not having these across-the-board cuts.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Burchett of Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity, and I have one question dealing with education, but I do want to offer my condolences. I lost both my parents. Dan Crenshaw says you're a stand-up guy, so that's okay with me.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
On both fronts.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I'm not going to ask you any more questions, so you're good for me. But my question dealt with education. I have a background in education. Both my parents are career educators, and I would submit to the committee the first place I would look for money is in the Department of Education itself. Their $68 billion budget. I dare say that any of the 3,912 employees up there has ever taught anybody to read at ceremonial. I would like to know, having said all that, the Congressional Budget Office projected increases in deficits and debts in fiscal year 2019. I would ask, where would you suggest making some of the cuts to the budget to fund your priorities? And if you could go into detail on why those cuts should be made.
I just want to say that it's possible that none of the people who work at the Department of Ed taught in your school, but a lot of those people at the Department of Ed are very dedicated former teachers and former administrators.
I'm sure they are, ma'am, but being a state legislator and being 8 years a county mayor, we really got tired of bureaucrats that were telling us how it was done elsewhere, when I think we'd be better served if we trusted our locals and our state governments to send that money to them and allow them to decide where to go, because one size definitely does not fit all. And in any time we were make a comparison, we would always, they would use the extremes to compare in their statistics. And as I've been told many times by statistics teachers, statistics don't lie, just statisticians. But I would ask that you would answer that question. Where would you suggest making some of those cuts to the budget to fund your priorities?
I think it's up to Congress to decide where to cut funding. I think this is part of the difficult decision that appropriators and members of the Budget Committee have to make choices about where the priorities are. And I think that every year the Appropriations Committee has a chance to reevaluate where they think the needs are and where the spending should go. The Department of Ed has not had funding increases much at all in the last few years. In fact, 2018 was the first year that funding went up by any real measure. The funding goes to a variety of different programs that go out, much of it based on formula grants to school districts. Some of it is competitive grant programs, some of it is money to college students, some of it is to institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our panel for being here, and my condolences also to you, Dr. Shaw. I've lost my mother and my dad, and I know that pain, and I hope that you and your family are doing well. And
Thank you. It's hardest for the
this period.
grandchildren, as you can imagine. Thank you.
Very difficult. So give them my regards and condolences. Let me ask you, well, first, let me just preface this by saying to the panel, and my question goes to you, Mr. Koziak, specifically. I'm the daughter of a veteran. My dad served 25 years in the Army. He served in World War II and the Korean War. So I certainly understand the need for a strong national defense and providing our brave troops with everything that they need to do what we ask them to do. But let me just ask you a little bit about this budget and the requirements for a strong national defense and supporting our troops. Now, last year, it was widely reported that the Pentagon was building its 2020 budget based on a total defense level of about $733 billion, including base plus OCO. As late as this fall, DoD officials were stating that the $733 billion was enough to fulfill our national defense strategy. But since then, President Trump has reversed that position twice. He reversed it, then reportedly changed his mind and increased it to about $750 billion after Secretary Mathis and other Republicans objected to the cut. So I'm concerned that we're going to continue to increase defense and OCO with no end in sight and without meaningful oversight. Now, as you may know, and I hope you remember or saw this report, the Pentagon, it actually buried its own report, but it found that $125 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse. And that report by the Defense Business Board, it identifies that spending could be saved over 5 years through reducing overhead and reforming back office business practices, such as contractor reform, reducing their excessive pay, making better use of information technology, and reducing unnecessary staff through attrition and early retirement. So to your knowledge, did the Defense Department change its strategy, first of all, since last fall? Has the Pentagon announced a new threat assessment that suggests we need to increase the defense spending over $733 billion? And then let me just ask you, in terms of a reasonable defense number, does this sound reasonable to you, given the huge number in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse and all of the other excesses of the Pentagon? I mean, why can't we get this budget under control?
Security strategy, to my knowledge, there has not been a change that would have triggered that kind of change in views on how much money is needed. I think there is certainly room in the Defense Department for finding savings, efficiency savings across the board and in a lot of different areas. That is an effort that I think Congress should should push with the Pentagon, and it's a long-term effort. So I think that is something that we should continue to focus attention on. I think ultimately, you know, there's a limit to how much you're going to get through these efficiency savings, and I think they do take time to actually implement those kinds of savings. So it's probably not a way of avoiding having to lift the caps in 2020 to help defense, but I think over the long term, certainly that is something that we need to focus attention on.
But given at least 150 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse, why can't we at least cut the budget by 150 billion?
Well, I'm not familiar with that, or I don't recall that report in particular. I'm guessing it was not $125 billion a year.
The Pentagon sort of kept that report. They released it and then pulled it back. They squashed it. But we know that there are those kinds of, we know that there's waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon. And we know also that there are missile systems, weapon systems being built now that probably will never, ever be needed or used. And so I'm trying to get a handle, and I know the public wants to see a strong national defense, but they do not want to see excessive spending by the Pentagon. And that's what we have seen year after year after year, and the political will to stop this is just not here until we hear from our officials that we don't need that kind of spending anymore. Anybody else have a comment on that? Who would know, give us some direction?
The gentlelady's time has expired, so.
Okay, thank
move
you
ahead.
very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Holding of North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes. Here, then Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a famous quote from my home state that says, "I come from a state that raises corn and cotton, cockleburs, and Democrats." It's fairly an old quote. And frothy eloquence neither convinces nor satisfies me. I'm from the show me state. You have to show me. Just break down where our fiscal house is for the United States. And I know when I'm back home talking to the people that I have the opportunity to serve, they get lost in all the zeros. When you say $1 billion or $1 trillion, I get lost when you say those numbers. So what I just did here listening, I'm trying to show the fiscal house of the show me state way. And the best way to break it down, and I think we have to understand this before we start deciding what programs are extremely important and which ones we have to keep and how we continue to manage it. But we have $22.5 trillion in debt. You take off 8 zeros, and then that's more of a manageable number you can think of. That's 225,000. Debt. Okay, how much money comes in to the federal government? Take off 8 zeros, then you have $35,000. It's more manageable. Median income household in Southeast Missouri is $40,000, so we can think about it from that perspective. Okay, so how much do we spend as a federal government? $4.4 trillion. Take off 8 zeros, you break it down to $44,000 a year. So if we're a fiscal house, we make $35,000 a year, and we spend $44,000 a year. We're spending $9,000 more a year if you take off the 8 zeros than what we're bringing in. However, we owe $225,000 on the credit card. Talking about taxing and spending. One thing that I do want to correct the record. I heard some of my colleagues on the other side, some of my friends that said that because of Trump's taxes, we are at a huge deficit. In fact, we had the director of CBO here just in the last couple weeks testified, and I asked him the question, how much is the deficit and the deficit spending has resulted from the Trump taxes? He couldn't give us a number. He said he would supply it. We still have yet to receive it. So there's no document, no proof that this committee has been provided showing that there has been any deficits from the Trump's tax results as of last year. What we do have, and he testified, we have the highest historic record of revenues ever for the history of this country for 2018, for this past year. And that is the first year of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The first year. And it's the highest number of revenues that's came in. He did testify to that. So clearly we have a spending problem because revenues are the highest they've ever been in this country. So when you have a spending problem, you have to look at it and decide, how are we going to break it down? How are we going to look at the programs that best work us? We also have a debt problem. The rules of this Congress have been changed to make it easier to increase our debt. If we pass a budget proposal, our debt will automatically go up. Some call it the Gephardt rule. I represent part of Dick Gephardt's old congressional district in Missouri. So, Mr. Gray, I want to ask you, what do you feel about elimination of the debt ceiling?
So on the debt ceiling, it has certainly evolved over time. Originally, when it was created, it was essentially to spare Congress the need to enact individual debt issuances. Certainly the practice of financing the federal government has changed in a long time, or since, and so it's become somewhat of a challenge to the Congress. It's always been a difficult vote, I'm aware of that. I am concerned that increasingly it is viewed as a hostage that can be shot in political negotiations, and I think that would be dangerous.
I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jayapal of Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I would just say before I get started to my friend, Mr. Smith, that I actually asked the CBO director about the tax cuts, and very clearly he said that they did not pay for themselves, that they did increase the deficit, and so seconds.
Did he give you a number? Because
He did
that's
not
what I
give me a
asked.
number. He did not give me a number, but in my questioning, but I have seen
made the comment,
some of
but
the
not a number.
statistics out there, and I think the point I just wanted to make is clearly the Trump tax cuts increased the deficit. Clearly they didn't pay for themselves. But let me just start by saying that it's been good to hear from all of you why non-defense spending makes our country stronger and safer. And in particular, I wanted to focus my questions on education, just as one example of where we might put some of our dollars. I'm concerned that our federal investment in education, which is just 2% of our total budget, is still below what it was in 2011, inflation adjusted. Meanwhile, Pentagon spending has doubled over the past decade, accounting for 17% of the budget for 2019. We spend about 3.5% of our GDP. 1 to 2%. I mean, if President Trump got what he wanted, it would be that European countries spent 2%. We are at 3.5%. Every day, people are feeling the sting of those warped priorities, and particularly our teachers. Public school teacher pay fell by $30 per week from 1996 to 2015, while pay for other college graduates with years in the workforce increased by about $124 per week, inflation adjusted. I believe that our teachers and our students need more, and I believe that education is actually a national security priority. These things aren't in competition with each other, except when we take money away from one to give to the other. So, Ms. Abernathy, can you explain why Title or inflation over the past decade?
Our dollar value, sound pretty big, but the reality is that there's been fierce competition for non-defense discretionary funding. And in the last few years, the allocation, I actually have a chart on this because
we can distribute it. We can distribute it after
if
as
you
well.
have it, the fourth chart, it shows the change in non-defense discretionary caps versus the change in the Department of Ed funding for each year. And the reality is that when the caps have been so tight, even with the increases, that the labor H Labor, Health and Human Services Education bill has not gotten a lot of funding, and there's a lot of really important programs in that bill, as there are in other non-defense bills, and priority has been given on a fairly bipartisan basis to some increases in NIH and other places, and it hasn't gone to Department of Ed. And so the big programs like Title I have not been able
at the federal level that started in 2008 have had a huge impact, I think, on state budgets that we have seen. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, a lot of the, something like half the state education budgets have just now gotten back to the level they were pre-recession.
And if we don't pick up the pace, we're going to continue to see teacher strikes, walkouts, because our students are not getting what they need and our families and communities are not getting what they need. As I mentioned earlier, the defense budget in 2019 amounted to 17% of the federal budget. That's $674 billion. If we took just 1% of that, just 1%, which would be $6.74 billion, and we applied relative to the current education budget?
It would, so I'm horrible at math in my head. I need an Excel spreadsheet to do this, but it's something
Should
like
I just tell you, because I
8%.
happen to do the current Department of Education budget. And so what would that mean for underfunded priorities like Title I aid and IDEA?
So believe it or not, a $10 billion increase would not even be a drop in the bucket to filling the need. Special ed is about $15 billion, I think. And I can't tell you right now.
Remember, this is an
$13
increase
billion.
of $6.74 billion.
Right, but special ed is at $13.2 billion, and it's less than 15% of the full funding.
Yeah.
If you were to add $6 billion to that, it would still be less than half of the full funding.
So we really need a lot to really address our education needs. What about higher education? How many students could be put through community college, for example, if we redirected that military budget spending? This is my last question, I see.
A lot, because the Pell Grant program, if you were to increase the maximum grants, you would, it actually filters down that the average grant goes up for everybody and it makes more affordable. You could change the expected family contribution and you could let more people benefit from
We'd
Pell.
pay for over 2 million students to attend a year of community college, just as an example. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a very important hearing, and I appreciate your having it.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Crenshaw of Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Dr. Shaw, I'd like to begin with you. It's from my hometown. And first, I want to say I appreciate all the work you've done for Harris County and the city of Houston. And I want to point out that you are a huge part in leading the medical response to disasters from Katrina and from Harvey. So you know a lot about this subject, and we really appreciate you being here. The line of questioning I want to do here is to really, in the couple minutes we have, maybe we'll set up another appointment. Health entities like yourself and the federal government. So, you know, we've got some recent experience in Houston on disasters, and I think you handled it pretty well. You were a huge part of that. Were there any situations, were there any lessons learned where federal government intervention actually impeded what you had to do, or helped you, or could have just done a better job partnering with you?
First of all, thank you for those kind words. We have seen in Houston, Harris County, an incredible number of emergencies, all the way back from when I first moved and was part of that emergency department setting with Tropical Storm Allison, through Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Ike, Harvey, 2 500-year floods, certainly the nation's first BioWatch hit, and then go down the list of an incredible number of emergencies. Now, as I mentioned, just confirming 3 measles cases on Monday. So we have unfortunately, but I'm proud of the incredible work that our public health department and certainly our partners do to keep our communities safe. What I would say is that the partnership between local, state, and federal government is absolutely critical. Oftentimes, the federal government provides that support, but I really believe strongly that local entities must be incredibly nimble, strong, and have the appropriate capacity where the federal government comes in and can integrate into the incident command structure that's set up at the local level. It should be local communities, local response systems that are making the calls, and the federal government coming in to certainly support the response that's already in place.
Okay, I appreciate that, and we should, we'll definitely link up when we're back home. My next line of questioning is on education. A good case for education as a whole, of course, but no one really disputes that. The real question when we're talking about the budget is spending on the margin. What does this extra dollar do for us? You mentioned there's a 7-to-1 cost-benefit ratio from early childhood. That's one data point. It comes from one study where they surveyed about 123 students. So don't want to dismiss that study completely, but it is just one data point. And this is the question I want to get at here, because I have a whole packet of other studies from a progressive think tank, the Center for American Progress, that really demonstrates that spending and outcomes are not necessarily related. It really depends on how you spend that money. And when we're building a budget, I mean, that's really the questions we have to ask. Where do we need to invest that will result in higher outcomes? I mean, would you agree with that generally?
Absolutely. And things like that aren't about higher outcomes or about, safety.
Right, but when it comes to education, we want to be investing in the right places, because again, we can pour through the data and we can show that in certain school districts they spend a certain amount per student, and in others they spend a different amount, a much higher amount per student, and they get way worse outcomes. So there's obviously something else at play. I also want to correct the idea that we should be thinking of our spending on education in terms of as a percentage of the federal budget. The reality is 90% of our education spending about that is local and state. And what we should really be looking at when we compare ourselves with other developed countries is how much we spend per student. And the United States spends about 20% more than the rest of the developed nations, OECD countries. So I just want to correct the record on that, and then ask, like, what are the top 3 things to invest in education, in your opinion?
So again, this organization that I am has 113 different members, and if you asked each of them, they would probably come up with a different answer because they're all working on different things that all go together. It doesn't make any sense to invest in early childhood education and then drop the child and never put any more money into maintaining access, equity, things that matter. It doesn't do any good to put a ton of money into STEM education in high school if you've got students who aren't ready to read and do math at the high school level that need that. So you need investments all along. And the federal investment does a bunch of different things. It fills in niches where the state and local funding for kids, because we have a state and local education system that is based on property taxes, you end up with very big disparities between what different localities can afford to do. You end up with programs like EventID, which helps school districts that are in areas that don't, because of the federal, have a large federal presence, either in military bases or Indian reservations where people are not paying taxes, but the students are going to schools, and so they have schools and needs, but not a way to pay for them. So there's a lot of things that the federal investments do that are not just sort of, what is the best dollar for this one? How can I get $1 of achievement for this? It's filling in places where it's absolutely needed.
Right, and each local level is going to have a different opinion on that, I'm sure, because different preferences. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Price of North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses today. This is very helpful testimony. I think we can conclude that the Budget Control Act, which still hangs over us, the decade isn't over, that Act covers, has Of course, the original Budget Control Act was an invitation to failure given the rise of anti-tax ideology on the Republican side. We were never going to get that grand bargain that the Budget Control Act anticipated, although Speaker Boehner, up to a point, did try. We weren't going to replicate the budget agreements, the comprehensive agreements of 1990, 1993, 1997, those agreements that contributed not just to balanced budgets, but to paying off $400 billion of the national debt. One would hope that historical lesson isn't too hard to learn, but it turns out that it is, and that our current economic situation is far more dire, but our political situation has not permitted anything like that. And of course, then sequestration came. That failure produced sequestration. Sequestration acts fell. And impossible. It's actually made appropriating impossible. The Republican side of the aisle, we've written appropriations bills to sequestration levels year after year, and those bills simply can't pass. And we've ended up then with these two-year budget agreements. Two-year budget agreements. But we typically reach those agreements after we do the right thing after we've tried everything else. A lot of budget drama ensues, a lot of shutdowns, threatened shutdowns, various crises. Adequate appropriations bills. So what I want to focus, and I'll start with you, Ms. Abernathy, but any others would chime in. In the end, we've gotten these two-year budget deals. I hope this time we can do it at the front end of the process with the budget resolution or whatever serves the purpose of a budget resolution that lets us write these appropriations bills at good levels to start with. But clearly, we pay a price for all this drama and all this uncertainty and this lurching from crisis to crisis, from budget agreement to budget agreement. And so none of you have focused particularly on the uncertainty, the price of uncertainty. We've been talking mainly about just overall funding levels, but I want you, of course, this latest shutdown has contributed to this atmosphere, but I'd like to ask you to address budget uncertainty and what kind of stake we have in early on getting our top-line numbers set, early on, so that we can write our appropriations bills on budget, on time, and everybody concerned will know what we're dealing with.
So in the education world, many of the K-12 programs are what's called forward funding, which means that the funding for the fiscal year comes out not on October 1st, but for July 1st, because October 1st is the middle of the school year already. But the reality is that if there's no funding certainty for programs well beyond October 1st or into January or into March like last year, you've got school districts that are having to make their budgets, which their budgets often start July 1st. They have to give out layoff notices to teachers because they don't know what their federal funding will be for the coming year. Years ago, when I was working in a Head Start program, or not Head Start, early childhood program, and we had grantees on an Indian reservation, and the government was functioning under a series of short-term continuing resolutions, and they needed to sign leases for their child care centers, and they couldn't because you can't make a promise to spend money that you don't have yet. And the Anti-Deficiency Act, you can't promise a year-long lease, and we have to tell them you can't sign your lease for your child care center. So the uncertainty has dire consequences for planning and ability to effectively use the money.
And I would, from a health standpoint, I would completely agree with my colleague here in terms of education, but also from the health standpoint. Uncertainty has profound impact on our ability to plan, our ability to make assurances to our communities, but also to our staff members, as they're also in the midst of that community looking at where the funding is going to come for their grants or the activities that they're involved in, both for themselves, but also, most importantly, for the community that they serve. And so uncertainty is an incredibly important issue, and I think it's something that really makes these two-year processes very challenging for the local level, because we oftentimes, especially in smaller jurisdictions, do not have that additional capacity, and so that's a big issue.
Mr. Kozak?
I just add, I agree with both my colleagues here, and I think in the national security world and certainly in the defense world, having uncertainty about what the level is going to be has a big impact on the ability to plan effectively and efficiently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ray, do you want to respond?
Thank you. I would agree with what my fellow witnesses said on that point, and that's why I made the point in my testimony that the budget process can allow this body to sort of get in front of that and take this on proactively.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're very welcome. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Norman of South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the panel for taking your time today. Let me just mention what my friend Congressman Smith mentioned about, we keep hearing You know, the tax cuts, you know, going against the budget is costing us. We've never had that number. But let me tell you a number that we have seen. And I'm from the private sector. I'm a real estate developer. I'm not a professional politician. I've really never liked politicians that much. But let me tell you a number that we can go with. 350,000 new manufacturing jobs. Growth in the economy. The last previous administration, 1.5% growth of GDP. We're now 3+. In the world I come from, there's an enthusiasm, there's a reason people are putting equity back in their business. And it's due to the tax cut of President Trump, the regulations that are cut. These are real numbers that you can't, that you can't dispute. And also, I would just say that, as one of my colleagues mentioned, that in the private sector, if you just take the position you're going to raise prices, you're going to have customers saying, bye-bye, we've got competition, we're not going there. But on the deficit that's been talked about, the $22 trillion, and by my estimation, it's probably in over $200,000 every man, woman, and child. We talk about it, but we never do anything about it. And Ms. Abernathy, you're exactly right when you said it's Congress's role to decide what to cut and not to cut. What I find from being up here is that everybody wants cuts until it cuts your particular program that affects your particular district. And when the hordes of lobbyists come out to assail you for doing any kind of cuts, and I'm tired of hearing numbers. As I said in committee yesterday, we keep talking about numbers that, that we're going deeper and deeper into red. It's like rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. It's now time for us to take the bull by the horns and do something. Now, Ms. Abernathy, do you think, and I keep hearing numbers on my friends from the left, free education, free health care, free this and that. If you, conservative estimates that I hear, 10 trillion over the next 10 years, is it possible to devise a tax increase system that will pay for the increases in spending, much less making a down payment on the debt?
So I'm not an economist, so I'm not really,
I'm asking your opinion. Is it possible to do that in government?
I think the idea of the government is that you've got two choices each time. You measure, the same way a family does. You have income coming in and you have cash flow going out. And, when you have a kid going to college, you take on some debt and then you hopefully earn some more money, or maybe someone goes and get a second job. Congress
That's true in
does
the
have a
private
choice.
sector. I'm talking about in government, where we are right now. Is it possible, do you think we can just raise the tax rates enough, keep this economy afloat, keep the growth, and pay for anywhere close to what we're talking about in new spending?
I think Congress is talking about some new spending. Some people in Congress are talking about some new spending programs. Some people in Congress are talking about looking at entitlement reform. Some people are talking about changing marginal tax rates. I think that some of the changes would happen gradually over time. There's a lot, the federal budget is not on a great long-term trajectory, so there are also changes that should be made. The talk about drastic cuts to non-defense discretionary is not quite decimal dust, but it's pretty small compared to the big picture. But I think that there are ways you can change a lot of different things that would put the economy or the budget on a fiscal path to balance, but it would take a while to do it.
Well, it wouldn't take long in the private sector. And in government, it takes longer because somehow people look on it as not their money. They look at it as something that drops out of heaven and comes down. But I'm telling you, the Main Street USA is paying attention now as never before. And unless we get a handle on it, and I agree, that's our responsibility. Let me ask you, we've got so many programs on autopilot. They receive funding, we have no debate. As far as accountability and wasteful spending, what is and I direct this to Mr. Gray and then to Ms. Abernathy, what's your, as far as accountability and I guess measuring it so the American people will have a number to look at?
So in terms of wasteful spending, that's, of course, is entirely in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
And so that's a problem in sort of a value judgment. And so rather, I think we spoke to this earlier, which is, okay, at least in terms of ensuring of those programs that we have, we should make sure that they're well-functioning and are benefiting the people they're intended to.
Thank you so much. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Kildee of Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this very important hearing. I appreciate the perspective of the witnesses here today. It's hard to ignore the context of the hearing. We just had a government shutdown as a result of our inability to come, I think, to what could have been a very easily settled conclusion on our priorities here, absent one issue. I think we all agree that that's no way to govern. And it's interesting that we're talking about self-imposed cuts that are done without an act of Congress by operation of law. We don't seem willing, and I don't want to go too deep in this, we don't seem willing to impose the same constraint on ourselves to trigger an automatic continuing resolution if we're unable to come to some agreement. We seem to think that it's okay to punish the American people for our failure to come together, and I think that at some point, I won't get into that, but I think obviously that's something we need to address. Similarly, in this hearing, it's been fairly well reaffirmed that arbitrary across-the-board cuts are no way to run the United States government. These cuts have an impact. They have consequence on our economy and our growth, and they also have consequence on the quality of life for the people that we work for. They have a consequence for our ability to keep ourselves safe. I think we all would acknowledge that the first obligation of our government is to keep us safe, to keep our citizens safe. And I think it's incredibly important that we point out that the mechanisms by which we keep our citizens safe are not limited to defense and military spending. The way we keep ourselves safe covers a broad range of very important initiatives. And discretionary budget cuts to non-defense programs will make America less safe. And I know that I may sound redundant when I say this, because I know a lot of members have heard me talk about my hometown. I come from Flint, Michigan, a community that has experienced tragic consequences as a result of the failure of government at every level to act effectively to keep the people safe. Triggering automatic cuts to important domestic priorities will put more people in this country at risk of great harm. And so I think it is important that we keep that in mind. If our priority is to keep America safe, we ought to act to keep America safe and not simply take the position that there's only one way we do that. There are real consequences for our failure. And I don't believe that the priorities that we have pursued adequately keep America safe. The consequences that my hometown have felt has changed the trajectory of those lives. People died. That little bit of magic that was stolen from some of the children in my hometown, one day at a time as a result of being exposed to dangerous, unsafe drinking water, is not an experience that is limited just to that community. Every day, other members of Congress on both sides of the aisle come to me and talk about the threat that their communities face to the safety of the people that they represent because of the inability of our collective governments at every level to properly invest in safeguards. So let's not fool ourselves into believing that somehow this is a question between domestic priorities and our obligation to keep America safe. It's the same thing. It takes different forms. Having said that, if I could just get, because I only have a minute left, an answer from Mr. Koziak. Given that as backdrop, do you think there is some ideal equilibrium? Do you have an opinion as to whether there's some ideal equilibrium between defense and other discretionary programs that keep us safe at home? Are we there? Are we getting closer or farther away from that equilibrium, if you believe one exists?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not in a position to really give an answer on what the right equilibrium is. I do think, as I pointed out in my statement, that we have to recognize that there's a lot of funding on the non-defense discretionary side that is security related. So when you're trying to balance things, you have to think about not only how much do we need for national security, but how much, what's the right balance between defense and non-defense national security, because there's at least $200 billion in the NDD budget.
But would you agree with my basic premise is that national security, I think, often is a misnomer in the sense that if you have your life or your well-being or the trajectory of the life of your child threatened by the fact that the federal government is walking away from its obligation to protect safe drinking water, isn't that a threat to national security?
I think that's absolutely, the way, putting it like that, I think is an absolutely great way of putting it, because, one thing that I'd encourage everybody to do is go through the budget and look through what these domestic agencies do, and a lot of it, it looks a lot like security, whether it's national security or not. Maybe that's a less important question.
Thank you. My time's expired. I appreciate your comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Hearn of Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and certainly the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Koziak, thank you for your testimony regarding the need to invest in America's economic and national security. I'd like to read, if I may, a quote from a gentleman that we all, Democrats and Republicans, obviously both sides of the aisle, are equally admirable of this gentleman when he read this or said this to the Senate committee back in 2017. Incorporating the broadest issues into your assessments, you should consider what we must do if the national debt is assessed to be the biggest national security threat we face. As President Eisenhower noted, the foundation of military strength is the economic strength in our few short years. However, we'll be paying interest on our debt, and it will be a bigger bill than we pay today for defense. Much of the interest in money is destined to leave America for overseas if we refuse to reduce our debt or pay down our deficit. What is the impact on the national security for future generations who will inherit this irresponsible debt and the taxes to service it? No nation in history has maintained its military power if it failed to keep its fiscal house in order, and that was from General Mad Dog Mattis. When you look at those issues, I think you testified earlier that there is a need to keep the defense going, and Mattis actually testified just last year that he felt to maintain, and other military experts, to maintain our economic strength, first to continue to catch up, that we needed to increase our defense spending 2 to 3% per year, basically in perpetuity, to keep up with the ever-growing threats that we have from Russia and China. And my colleague on the left mentioned that we spent a lot on defense, more than some of 3 or 4 other nations combined. We're not trying to take those countries over. We're not trying to invade those countries. They're trying to harm us. And so it is unfortunate we're trying to defend against multiple nations that are very large nations. It's flattering they want to be here and they want to be like us, but we have to defend ourselves. So would you agree with Mr. Mattis and other military experts that we need to continue, get on a regular increase in spending in defense? And if not, why not?
Well, I would certainly, it's a very good question. I would certainly agree that we need to bring defense back up to, we can't have a $71 billion cut. That would be devastating in 2020. I also agree with his comment about addressing the debt over the long term. I think when we need to look at raising taxes and scaling back some mandatory spending programs. I don't have a particular level in mind for defense over the long term. I do think some growth is necessary. Certainly you have to, at a minimum, keep up with inflation. And I think we need to look at that both on the defense and non-defense side, as I say, since they both have important security-related programs.
Mr. Gray, do you think, given the nation's projected $11.6 trillion deficits over the next decade, do you believe there would be a merit in offsetting any increases to discretionary spending with reforms to mandatory spending?
Yes.
And do you have any opinions? Not you don't have to have a spreadsheet, but any opinions on that?
Well, I do have a spreadsheet on my computer, but that spreadsheet is part of a overall budget plan that I'm working on. That's kind of my first best option would be for this Congress, really any Congress in the future as well, to embark on the fiscal consolidation to get the debt onto a sustainable trajectory. That necessarily means making reforms to the large and fast-growing entitlement programs. And the menu of options that you can sort of deploy in that effort are extensive. But I think that would be sort of the first best approach. The second best option would reflect the compromises made in 2013 and 2015. They weren't major entitlement reforms, but there were some programmatic reforms, some of which will yield substantial savings over time. I think those are good models if the Congress isn't going to sort of do the grand bargain under the big fiscal consolidation.
Much has been said about the president's want to be a protectionist country and not look at globalization as an opportunity. So for those naysayers that I'm a global guy, I think global economies are very, very important. As we look at going forward, there's been much said about paying for some of these offsets, if you will, to some of these increased spending programs by going back to the corporate tax code and moving it from 21 to 25 or 26, pick a number any day, how many billions do you want? How much harm do you think that would do in light of the fact that many developing nations have actually lowered their rate since we lowered our rate?
Right. I don't think that would be a particularly efficient way of offsetting the discretionary increases being contemplated here.
So really, we're left just with one option. That's just raise income taxes on everybody to the point that we run out of other people's money to pay for the things that we can't afford anymore. And there was once a real famous lady said that was the definition of how socialism actually fails.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member as well. I look forward to the enthusiasm in this committee to do a job that is long overdue. I am optimistic. I'm frankly going to project lifting the budget caps. I want sequester to go into the dawn of yesteryear because obviously the grand bargain did not rise to the occasion. But let me put this in the record as I quickly ask questions of the witnesses, and let me thank you very much. I was delayed because I was in judiciary and in the midst of oversight of this administration, which obviously has not been done for a period of time. But according to the Congressional Budget Office, the U.S. will collect $1.74 trillion in individual income taxes in the current September ending fiscal year of last year and $22.38 trillion over a decade. A 10% reduction then would cost $174 billion for 1 year or $2.24 trillion over a decade. And this was October 23rd, 2018. Of course, this is to respond to I think a question that the gentleman made that he didn't have any facts about the impact of the Trump tax cut. New estimates of GOP's second tax would add an additional $3.2 trillion to the federal deficit over a decade, according to a centrist think tank. So we can find our resources or our numbers in many different places, but I think the bottom line is, yes, there has been some increase in manufacturing, and who knows, that could have been in any setting to create an increase in manufacturing, and I'm glad that it is. But we do know that there are many, many people who are still unemployed. And so my questions are going to be around my enthusiasm and my optimism of developing a budget resolution that really takes the test of Hubert Humphrey. The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of their life, the children, those who are in the twilight of their life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of their life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. Now that looks like old-fashioned talk, but it is amazing to me that is considered old-fashioned talk. And it is that because my friends on the other side of the aisle continue to use as the only measure of fiscal responsibility is the reining in, cutting, chopping away, dismantling, dismembering entitlement. And that tax cuts as well provide a deficit and don't do much because it certainly doesn't do much for what we call working Americans or others. So let me raise these questions. As I do so, let me acknowledge Dr. Shaw, a dear friend and someone who we have worked on, and I just want to emphasize he is truly a hands-on physician, having come out of the emergency medicine background and now leading our Harris Public Health. So let me first say to you, Dr. Shaw, welcome. And one of the agencies, as you well know, that I've been a champion of, the Centers for Disease Control, NIH, and we have experienced Ebola, and we have experienced Zika, we have experienced a measles outbreak as I was leaving. What is the importance of us funding Centers for Disease Control, NIH, as it impacts public health? And my time is short, and I have two other questions.
First of all, thank you so much for those kind words. Absolutely critical. What happens in funding federal agencies such as CDC, NIH, et cetera, is that those dollars actually, at the end of the day, they come to state level and certainly down to local level and to local communities. So ultimately, if we cut those agencies in ways that are across the board or even sometimes surgical, in the end result is that local communities and local members of those communities are impacted by those cuts.
So those trillions of dollars that has gone into Republican tax cuts, if that is not utilized or replaced, we're seeing, because you're in discretionary spending, non-defense discretionary spending, you've seen dollars go down in Centers for Disease Control in terms of coming back out to local communities.
Well,
You've actually seen that.
Absolutely, and I think that real shift from healthcare delivery, where we're already spending those dollars, to shift it upstream to public health and investment upfront, so we have the downstream consequences diminished. That's the equation, not increasing the dollars necessarily, but trying to find ways to spend them more wisely.
And I join you in that. That's why I think this committee can do a budget that they should do aggressively. To both Ms. Abernathy and Mr. Gray down here. One, you understand that we're trying to construct a census that works. You hear the word lawsuits about citizenship being asked, a major budgetary deterrent as far as I'm concerned. Your comments on that and the importance of structuring the census right as it ties to funding and a budget. And then, Mr. Gray, I'm very interested in national security issues, but you heard my numbers about the tax cuts. Can we find common ground to acknowledge how the tax cuts are, but as well to find common ground as relates to national security that is outside of defense? Could you just answer? And I thank the chairman for the brief indulgence.
Just quickly, that having an accurate census count has huge impacts on how education dollars are spent in local and state areas.
Mr. Chairman, if he can just, one moment.
Mr. Gray, yes, go ahead.
Certainly, that would certainly be my hope, and I think the budget process is the appropriate vehicle for trying to find that common ground.
Good. Gentlelady's time has
Thank you, Mr.
expired.
Chairman.
Ms. Omar of Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, for this important conversation. Oh, it's not on. All right. Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, for this important conversation. I truly believe budgets really are a value statement, and I am with my colleague from Texas on really having an old-fashioned conversation about this, and speaking really to what it means for us to have an aggressive budget that focuses on the needs of our communities, and one that speaks to truly having prosperity in this country for everyone. I wanted to ask, maybe this was discussed while I wasn't here, but I was interested in talking to you, Ms. Abernathy? Okay. And see if you can tell us what increase for education funding has been for the last 10 years. What percentage has education funding been?
It hasn't increased. The high water mark was 2011 until 2018, this last year, when Congress provided a very large increase for non-defense discretionary funding in 2018, and that was the first year that the Department of Ed funding, which I'm using as a proxy for education, there's actually education funding.
So you're saying zero increase since 2011?
Now it is, 2018 it got a slight increase, so it is now higher.
What percentage was it? Okay, well, we can look at it later. It's good, okay. What is the percentage of education funding in our discretionary budget?
It is $70 billion for the Department of Ed out of a
Percentage.
discretionary budget of $1.3 trillion. So I told you I'm horrible at math in my head, but less than, it's.
Less than 2%?
Well, less than 2%, for that's the whole budget, not the discretionary budget. I thought you were asking for just the discretionary budget.
Okay.
But it's less, for the federal budget, it's significantly less than 2% of the whole budget.
All right, wonderful. And Mr. Shah, how about for healthcare funding? What percentage increase for the last 7 years?
I can't give you a specific percentage increase, but I will say that the healthcare overall health budget has, our expenditures have increased. I think one of the challenges is that the public health side, the upfront investment structure, as well as decreases in technology and surveillance activities. And that's where we need to shift that cost curve.
Yeah. And how much of our federal budget goes to healthcare?
That is a great question. It depends on which GDP you look at in terms of the numbers, but we're looking at that 15% marker. But again, it's the healthcare includes medical research and includes an incredible amount of other dollars that go in to both the public sector and the private sector combined. So that percentage is sometimes a moving target.
Oh, wonderful. And Mr. Koziak, what percentage goes into defense?
3 to 4% typically of GDP goes to defense, and the federal budget probably about 20%.
Okay. I have something like 53%. Where's the discrepancy in that?
I'm sorry. Oh, discretionary.
Yes.
Yes. It's closer. It's around 55% typically.
Okay.
Yeah.
55%. So we have something like 7%, 15%, and 55% for defense. Okay. I wanted to ask you in regards to education, is there a correlation between some of the domestic threats to security and education?
Absolutely. I mean, we need to have people who, the military is a very broad group, and you need people with boots on the ground, but you also need programmers, you need cybersecurity people, you need people designing things, weapon systems. I mean, you need to have a well-educated military ready to serve.
And certainly, what I would add to that is that education and health have so many overplays and so overlaps. And so when you have what we call social determinants of health, which include education and transportation and housing, that really impacts health and vice versa. So I think it's really important to remember it's not an either or, it's an and.
Yeah, so investing in education, investing in healthcare could be an investment in caring for the safety and the well-being of all Americans domestically and internationally. All right, wonderful. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member for 10 minutes.
I thank the distinguished chairman, and let me just say, as part of the record, unrelated to our hearing today, I consider myself to be one of the luckiest members on the Republican side in a leadership position because I have the and I mean that in all sincerity, it's not for show. It has been intimated before that if you put Yarmouth and Womack in the room and lock the door, we can fix the problems associated with budgets in the United States Congress, and we are dadgum close to that right now. You know, we could lock these doors, and John, I think you and I in about 30 minutes could probably fix a lot of the problems that have been discussed here today, because while we disagree on some policy-related issues, we both recognize the need that has been expressed and was expressed in the State of the Union the other night, the need for us to work together, get to the table, and try to figure out how to make this whole thing work. And when I hear guys like Dan Kildee and Seth Moulton, these are all dear friends of mine, and I have an enormous amount of respect for them. And while we may disagree from time to time on policy, I do think there is a recipe there, a chemistry that we can build on to actually do some great things. And one more addition to that comment is that Mr. Yarmouth was a key member of the Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform and was in the yes column when we got this proposal, albeit somewhat limited in scope, to the finish line. And two guys sitting right here that are the budget chairman and now the ranking member had some ideas that could actually improve our process, and it's a doggone shame that we didn't get that across the finish line, but we'll save that for another conference. One of my colleagues across the aisle, Ms. Jayapal, mentioned earlier in leading into an education funding question and used teacher pay as kind of the metric for us to basically call for more spending on education. So, Ms. Abernathy, how much of our federal budget in education actually goes to teacher salaries?
Not a lot. There's a $2.1 billion teacher and school leader state grant program.
So I think we could just agree that it's negligible.
It's mostly state and local funding.
Yeah. Is that where it should be?
That's the system that we have.
So what is the role of the federal government in education?
There's a multifold role. One of it is providing student aid to students who want to go to college in the form of grants and loans. Grants based on income and loans are available to everybody who want them. Other places the federal government provides federal funding in education in the K-12 world, or in adult education, or in CTE, career and technical education, is to fill gaps where state and local funding has not been able to fully meet the need, for instance, for special education. Some of the programs are based on helping schools, districts with high numbers of low-income students where their state and local, or their local tax base isn't high enough to support the things that schools need, because there are some basic things that all schools need.
Yeah, I'm a former mayor in a city that put a premium on education. We had among the highest property tax rates because the people where I live believed in public education. There are other cities, however, that don't look at it that way, and therefore their millage rates are lower, and the inability to hire qualified teachers, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is a local decision.
Right. And there's some places that don't have the tax base to do it. Some of the rural districts where you've got students in a bus going 45 minutes a day each way to a regional district. I mean, there's not a lot of people to tax to raise local money for the school, but their kids need the education.
Yeah, I totally agree, but and perhaps maybe there are some ways. 80 years ago, we electrified a lot of the rural areas because we knew the electricity was pretty important, and maybe we could do some things from an infrastructure perspective that could really elevate our ability to educate our kids, namely through broadband and the ability to leverage technology to deliver education into some of these rural areas. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's a big deal, personally. I want to shift back to defense for a minute. Mr. Koziak, we talked earlier about how important it is for defense, and I think it was Chris Stewart that indicated how should we build a defense, how should we fund defense? What metrics should we use to be able to fund defense?
Well, I think, it's hard in the case of defense because defense, unlike a lot of programs, is partly what you're doing, the military is doing at any given time, but it's also an insurance policy. And, depending on what your view of the threats out there, you may think you need more or less insurance. So it's always a hard thing to measure, because a lot of what defense does is deter and not actually fight and defend. But it's obviously an important deterrence policy, so it's hard.
So we use our national defense strategy to try to, I'm getting to the threat here for just a minute, because that's what I believe. I believe that anytime you're going to spend money on national security, and you can't look at it in a one-year window, particularly in procurement areas, because that could be it is always a multi-year, sometimes multi-generational defense budget based on the perceived threats, known and perceived. Would you not agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the way it should be done. That is the way we try to do it. I think you also obviously have to make internal trade-offs on other priorities as well, on the non-defense side, other areas of security. So it's not all just looking at outside threats, looking at...
And it is a constitutional imperative.
Absolutely.
Provide for the common defense.
Absolutely.
In your opinion, is the threat greater?
Greater than...
Greater than, say, 20 years ago?
I think it is. It has changed. It has evolved. It is certainly, in many ways, not the same. It's a very different threat than when I got into this business back during the Cold War. And in some ways,
so in the old days,
it's safer.
In old days,
it
was force on force. It was state versus state. Now it's multi-dimensional. It's in space, and it's next door, and it's all around us, right?
Right, and I think you need multi-dimensional approaches to addressing that.
Which is pretty expensive to try to provide. I mean, you're trying to defend yourself in all territories. It's a worldwide threat. It's a homeland threat. So the threat, I think we could all agree, is probably elevated right now. If you ask 100 people on the street and ask them about threats to the United States, I would guess that they would say, they might differ. It may be Russia to one, China to another, and Iran or North Korea or ISIS, or pick from the menu, but Most people would say, I think, that, at least in my district, that we have an elevated threat. And if we have an elevated threat, and if we're going to base our defense budget on the threat, then it stands to reason that we're probably going to spend more money on defense, right?
Well, I think it would be an elevated threat compared to 15 years ago or 20 years ago. I'm not sure it would be an elevated threat across the board and compared to the Cold War.
So my colleague from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, in her questioning said, and I can't quote her, she did use the word parity, that if we're going to increase defense spending, then we ought to do parity for the non-defense side. Would that be an imperative for this country?
Well, I think given that 40 to 60% of non-defense discretionary spending goes to security-related programs, which is as important, I think, as defense spending in terms of addressing security, I think some level of parity probably is necessary.
Okay. Are you familiar with how much debt we have?
Yes.
Pick the number. What is it?
About $20 billion.
22, a little over $22 trillion.
Trillion, yes.
Trillion with a T. That's another zero. The deficit this year, are you familiar with what the deficit will be this year?
I think about $900 million, $900 billion.
$900 billion. That's just to pay the minimum payment due. So obviously, we're going to spend more money than we take in, and because of that, we have to make some tough decisions. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's like anybody else at home. If you got more going out than you have coming in, you got to figure out what likely on the expense side, what you got to cut, what you don't need, and those kinds. A lot of things you'd like to have, but at the end of the day, there are some things you just can't afford to have because you're trying to take care of the things that you must do, pay the mortgage and put food on the table and those kinds of things. The federal government operates a little differently than some households, but the concepts, the principles, I think remain the same. I put a slide up there. Does that surprise you that in 1965, about 34% of this budget went to mandatory programs, and today it's commanding 70% of the federal budget?
It's been notable growth. It doesn't surprise.
Put the other slide up there. So there's a defense, not that slide. I'm talking about the, not that one. I'm talking about the showing the rise in mandatory spending and the cuts in discretionary spending. All right, CBO, and I know I'm about out of time. CBO says, as a percentage of GDP, spending on mandatory programs is going higher, but spending on discretionary programs as a percentage of GDP is going lower. So with that said, would you agree, as I said in my opening statement, that this Congress, this committee, appropriators, leadership in both sides, House and Senate, should have a plan for how do we address runaway entitlement programs that unchecked are going to command in 2029 78% of the federal budget, which is going to cut every single thing and cut into every single thing that we've talked about on the discretionary side. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that it is critical that we address the debt over the long term. It's a real challenge that needs to be addressed through both tax increases probably and entitlement reforms.
That's hard, isn't it?
That is hard. Both are hard.
Yeah, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for the time.
Absolutely, and I now yield myself 10 minutes, and I would like to first thank you for the kind remarks, and I think we could make a lot of progress if we didn't have to answer to anybody else. That's the big consequence. First of all, I want to just establish for the record, because Mr. Smith and Ms. Jayapal had a different opinion as to what CBO has said about the impact of the tax cuts, the 2017 tax cuts on the deficit. Their report was that the tax cuts contributed $164 billion to the deficit in 2018, $228 billion in 2019, $272 in 2020, and projected it out. The projected impact on the deficit comes down after the tax cuts for the middle class expire, but substantial increase. And of course, he said we have record income, and the answer to that is, well, we may, but the income would have been that much greater and the deficit that much less if the tax cuts were not in place. The ranking member raises, I think, the critical question in many of these areas. We don't dispute that national defense and national security is a national priority. It is the responsibility of the federal government, and we deal with that way. The questions arise as to many other areas in which the federal government's involved, and education is one of those that is controversial to a certain extent. And we've heard calls for the abolition of the Department of Education. And you know, I spent my first term in Congress on the Education and Labor Committee, and we spent that entire Congress trying to reauthorize No Child Left Behind, ESEA. And of course, that was the one question that we had, and this relates to what Mr. Burchett said. NCLB was a George W. Bush initiative, and it was designed to make up for those gaps, and so that a child in a state that did not think that education was a top priority would have access to the same quality education that a child in a state that did take its responsibilities for education more seriously. And I'm not familiar with what goes on in Tennessee or in Arkansas. I'm familiar with what goes on in Kentucky, and even some localities do a lot better job than other areas. But overall, our state, when you look at the budget, our state spends more on education than anything else, and has still had to cut spending for education over the last few years, particularly higher education. So we're all figuring out how to fund education, however we package that. And I think Mr. Crenshaw talked about the fact that there was, it's not just a matter of how much you spend. And directly on education, and this has been referenced before, Dr. Shaw did, does not really calculate all the factors that go into whether a child is well educated or not. The health of the child, the housing of the child. About 10% of my students in my district are homeless at one time during the year. It's an astounding number. We have one of the largest school districts in the country in Louisville. And we have 50% of our students change schools at least once during the school year because they're being shifted around from grandparent to aunt to whoever they may be homeless during that time too. So when we look at non-defense discretionary spending, we have to look at housing, we have to look at transportation, you mentioned, we have to look at healthcare, and we have to look at nutrition, because all of those expenditures that the federal government makes contribute to overall the educational attainment of the child, of the possibility. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is that as part of the Tax Cut Act, the Tax Act of 2017, we limited the deduction for state and local taxes. And one of the complaints from high taxing states like Massachusetts and New York and so forth is, hey, we're doing what we feel we need to do for our children, not just our children, all sorts of areas, our citizens, but we're funding education at a certain level, and you are penalizing us now for being willing to tax our citizens to make those services available. My question is, have you seen or heard of any assessment as to whether that part of the tax code, and it's probably too early to tell, but I'm just asking, has had any impact on what states are doing with education?
I don't know the answer to that, and in part because a lot of the studies about state education budgets take a couple of years to come out because you have to wait and see what happens. So some of the most recent stuff I've seen is looking at the 2015 budget, for instance, for education funding. I think we'll see that borne out in the coming year or two.
Appreciate that. I refer to Mr. Kilde's talking about water security, and also early on in the hearing, Mr. Higgins talking about infrastructure. You didn't talk about infrastructure as a part of national security, but would you consider infrastructure spending as part of our national security profile?
Well, I did actually, in my broader definition of security, consider some infrastructure funding. It's obviously, what I was looking at was just focus on the discretionary portion of the budget and just the amount that Congress actually appropriates. So look at transportation, Corps of Engineers as just sort of examples of areas that provide infrastructure. So I think if you have a very narrow definition of national security, you're probably not looking at those programs. But if you look more broadly, I think clearly that's important.
I appreciate that. And Dr. Shaw, I'm not sure, you gave us this number, so I'll ask, my memory may be faulty. What percentage of your budget or what percentage of national public health is funded by the federal government?
So from a standpoint of our budget, we, to about 30, I would say about 30% of our budget is that, and obviously it varies across the system. Local jurisdictions that are smaller, obviously they oftentimes more rural frontier jurisdictions may have a higher percentage. That's why the capacity is really impacted when you have a change from the federal system. And one thing I did want to make mention is that earlier I had heard the dynamic about if it's a family and really looking at some ways that you can to actually decrease expenditures. And I think there's another piece that's very important to this, which is the investment piece, right? So if I have $1 as a family member and I invested in something today, it's still an expenditure today, but if it yields back $100 a year from now or five years from now I've actually brought something back. So I don't think it's really just this either or. It's this holistic concept of how we're really looking at how spending and revenue comes in, but also this investment, and I believe strongly investment in public health and health really helps us in avoiding those unnecessary higher level costs in a healthcare system like the emergency department or healthcare system in other ways.
Thank you for that. Mr. Kosiak, in the wake of the government shutdown, there's been much interest in legislation. I think one of our members mentioned this, in creating an automatic continuing resolution. And some of our members on this committee are interested in that possibility. Speaking of from your experience at OMB, could you expand on the parameters that would be necessary for that kind of legislation to be successful from the standpoint of executing it and implementing it?
Well, certainly, I mean, I appreciate the people's interest in that and looking for a solution to avoid government shutdowns. My own view is that that's probably not a good mechanism to move forward with. I think my concern would be that it leads to sort of a default where parts of the government are continually funded on this basis automatically, which means you don't get to raise some parts and lower some parts. You don't get to change programs within different departments that are on this sort of automatic pilot. So I think as bad as and hard as it is to go through government shutdowns, I think it's a sort of decision-forcing event that makes Congress make tough choices, and so I would not probably advocate that. I do think if you had it, obviously you'd have to at a minimum grow with inflation, but I think it's probably not the best mechanism.
Does anybody else on the panel have a thought about that, whether automatic CRs are a good idea? Mr. Gray?
So I think one of the most important questions always asked in matters of public policy is compared to what? What is your counterfactual? I think we would all agree that the automatic CR approach is not ideal. And then the question is, well, compared to what? And certainly compared to, I think, regularizing shutdowns, which I think we would all consider bad, I think it would be worthwhile in that context. If that is not going to be the custom going forward, then it may have less utility. So I think it's just important to consider the context.
Thank you, Ms. Abernathy.
I would just say that it's not Congress has the ability to stop shutdowns, and Congress does have the ability to act to get appropriations done. And so I think that putting in this default that supports frozen funding forever or a cut in funding or whatever the automatic CR has takes away the oversight and the ability of Congress to do this. And I think that, as others have said, that the shutdown is a horrible outcome, but it's not it doesn't have to happen. It's not like we can look at it and can't stop it.
I appreciate
those
those
local communities such as ours. I mean, I can't think of anybody that I met or walked and talked to who said, "Oh, the shutdown is a fantastic approach that the federal government has taken." And I think that is a real challenge. Is really looking at ways that we can proactively really build that capacity across the system that we're talking about here and not really silo. I think the false dichotomy is when we try to silo into what's happening, but really thinking broad-based on how do we invest in the future of our country and certainly in the American people.
I appreciate that. For the record, the Joint Select Committee, which the ranking member chaired, we didn't get much resonance for that idea in that joint committee either for automatic CRs. Well, with that, I want to thank the panelists for being with us today once again. It's been very valuable testimony. Members should be advised they can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.